If I have to choose between my wife and my mother, I'll choose my wife every time." Those were the last words my son said before throwing me out of his mansion. 2 weeks later, he dumped his 8-year-old boy on my porch in the middle of a rainstorm and called him a broken child nobody can fix. But after living with him for a few weeks, I discovered the truth. The boy wasn't broken at all. He was a genius. Together, we uncovered something extraordinary hidden by his grandfather. Then my son suddenly returned with a lawyer and a secret that changed everything. Thank you for being here. Before we begin, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment telling me what you're doing as you listen. Driving, cooking, working, or resting. Your presence matters to me. Quick note, some details here are fictionalized to highlight the lesson, but the heart of this story, the message is what I hope stays with you. I had bandaged soldiers in Fallujah who thought they'd die on those sands, but standing in my son's Portland mansion that October afternoon, I felt something different shatter inside my chest. At 60 years old, after 2 combat tours as an army nurse in Iraq and Afghanistan, I thought I understood what it meant to be dismissed. I was wrong. Paloma sat perfectly composed in her ivory designer dress, her 33-year-old face, showing no emotion as she read from the iPad that would exile me. Each complaint came with dates and direct quotes, as though she'd been preparing evidence for trial. Point 7, October 3rd. You questioned Silas's medication regimen in front of guests. She said, her voice flat and professional. Point 8, October 9th. You suggested we were over-medicating him. Point 9. I stopped listening to the words and started listening to the construction beneath them. This wasn't anger. This wasn't spontaneous family conflict. This was systematic documentation spanning months, maybe longer. Paloma had built a case against me the way prosecutors build cases against criminals. Clayton stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Portland's West Hills, 35 years old, in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my monthly pension. He wouldn't look at me. The same eyes I'd watched for fever symptoms during 3 straight nights when he was 7. Those eyes now studied the hardwood floor as though it held answers. He placed a thick envelope on the glass coffee table between us. "Mom, you need space," he said. "So do we. There's enough here for 3 months. 3 months' rent. Not a conversation, not a question. A severance package." The white marble living room felt suddenly cavernous, all that expensive empty space around us. Through those windows, October lights slanted across the West Hills in shades of gold and rust. Beautiful. Cold. I looked at the envelope, then at my son, then at Paloma, who had stopped reading and now watched me with the patience of someone waiting for a transaction to complete. "All right," I said. 2 words. They cost everything to say. Paloma set down the iPad. Clayton exhaled as though he'd been holding his breath. Neither of them followed me to the door. I walked out of that mansion the way I'd walked out of field hospitals after losing patients upright controlled, saving the braking for later. I didn't take the envelope. By 6 o'clock, I was driving south on Highway 99W through the Willamette Valley, my 15-year-old sedan rattling slightly above 60 miles per hour. October rain began tapping the windshield light at first, then steady. 3 hours of highway stretched ahead, maple trees along the roadside glowing red in the fading light. My hands were steady on the wheel. That's what 2 combat tours teach you, how to keep your hands steady while everything else falls apart. How does a mother raise a son for 35 years, teach him to read, nurse him through fevers, pay for his law school with money she didn't have, and end up standing before him like a terminated employee? How does love become HR paperwork with 11 documented points? I didn't have answers. I had a farm in rural Oregon that my husband Russell had made me promise to keep. The rain picked up as I passed Salem, then Albany. Small towns with lighted windows, families sitting down to Friday night dinners. I'd been living in Clayton's mansion for 8 months, ever since he'd insisted I move in after Russell passed. At the time, I thought it was generosity, concern for his widowed mother living alone. Now I understood it had been surveillance. Russell had died 3 years ago, pancreatic cancer that took him in 4 months, despite every treatment, every prayer, every bargain I tried to make with a God I wasn't sure was listening. Before he went weak but deliberate with every word he'd left me, a voicemail I'd saved and listened to more times than I could count. I played it now for the fourth time in 3 years, his voice filling the car. "Margaret, don't sell the farm," Russell said, using my full first name, the way he only did when something mattered beyond measure. "No matter what happens, promise me." A pause. Labored breathing. Then, "They'll ask. They'll pressure you. Don't give them the land." Who would ask? Who would pressure me? Russell had died before explaining, and for 3 years I'd kept that promise without understanding the reason behind it. Clayton had asked twice about selling. Paloma had mentioned once casually how much the property was worth, how I could live comfortably in a nice Portland condo with the proceeds. I'd said no both times. Russell had made me swear. The highway curved through darkness now, my headlights catching rain in silver streaks. I thought about Silas, my 8-year-old grandson who barely spoke, who watched the world with careful eyes that tracked too much. The questions I'd asked about his medication. Point 7, point 8, point 9 hadn't been interference. They'd been the same questions I'd ask about any child taking that many prescriptions. But asking questions about Silas had gotten me systematically expelled. By 9 o'clock, I turned onto the gravel road leading to the farm. Russell and I had worked for 30 years, 120 acres of barley fields, and the small house we'd built together in 1992. The eastern plot where Russell had spent his last 5 years developing something he'd called agricultural revolution, some new barley hybrid I didn't fully understand. I parked and sat in the silence after the engine stopped. Rain drummed on the roof. No one waited inside. No one would call to check if I'd arrived safely. The Oregon rain continued to fall, and for the first time in months, I could breathe fully. I didn't know then what I know now. I didn't know that in exactly 2 weeks everything would change. I didn't know what was buried in that eastern barley plot or why Russell had worked so carefully to protect it. I didn't know that Clayton's expulsion of me wasn't about space or family boundaries. It was about land and money, and something Russell had created that people would kill to possess. I had kept Russell's promise for 3 years without understanding the reason. But something was waiting there. In the dark Oregon soil, something worth protecting. And in 2 weeks, on a rain-hammered night at 11 o'clock, I would open my door to find my son holding a soaked 8-year-old boy who wouldn't meet my eyes, and finally begin to understand why my husband had made me swear never to sell that land. The knock came at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night, sharp and insistent over the sound of October rain hammering the farmhouse roof like fists demanding entry. 2 weeks had passed in quiet solitude, 2 weeks of silence broken only by wind through barley stalks and the settling sounds of the old house Russell and I had built. I'd started sleeping again, started breathing, without that tightness in my chest. The knock shattered all of it. I opened the door and found Clayton gripping the hand of a small boy in a soaked jacket 3 sizes too large. 8-year-old Silas Bentley stood on the rain-soaked porch, clutching a small green notebook against his chest, like it was the only thing in the world he owned, his eyes fixed downward as water streamed from his dark hair. A child who'd learned that the safest place to look was always at the ground. "Mom, thank God you're home," Clayton said, already pushing forward. "We have an urgent business trip. Just keep him for a few days." The words came too fast, rehearsed wrong. Rain plastered Clayton's expensive shirt to his shoulders. Behind him in the driveway, his black sedan idled with headlights cutting through the downpour. Through the rain-streaked passenger window, Paloma sat motionless, her face illuminated by phone screen glow, refusing to step out into the weather or acknowledge what was happening on my porch. "Clayton, wait, what medication? What's going on with—" He shoved a crumpled paper into my hand. "The list explains everything. We'll call you Sunday." He was already backing toward the car, already turning away. He stopped once, hand resting on the car door handle, not turning to face me. "He's broken, Mom," Clayton said, his voice flat like he was reporting a weather forecast. "Nobody's been able to fix him. Don't expect to." The door slammed. Tail lights disappeared into the rain. Silas stood frozen on the porch water, pooling around his oversized sneakers, still not looking up. "Clayton, I stood in the open doorway, rain blowing cold across the porch, watching the red taillights shrink into the dark until there was nothing left to watch. I looked down at the small boy dripping on my porch, at the green notebook pressed against his thin chest, at the way his shoulders curved inward like he was trying to make himself smaller. "Come inside, sweetheart," I said quietly. "Let's get you dry." He followed me in without a word, without a sound, without lifting his eyes from the floor. In the kitchen under fluorescent light, I spread the crumpled paper flat on the counter, a medication list handwritten in Paloma's precise script. My nursing instincts honed over 20 years of emergency medicine, 2 combat deployments, and countless children who came through field hospitals with injuries their parents wouldn't explain, started screaming before I finished reading the first line. Risperidone, clonidine, guanfacine, sertraline, melatonin, diphenhydramine, 6 different drugs for an 8-year-old child. I read it again slower, checking dosages. The combinations made my hands tighten on the paper. Risperidone and clonidine together, that wasn't treatment, that was chemical restraint. The kind of pharmaceutical cocktail you'd use to sedate someone, not help them. The dosages were carefully calibrated not for healing, but for suppression. What kind of father leaves his 8-year-old son on a doorstep in a midnight rainstorm with nothing but a medication list and a lie about Sunday? The kind who needs the child somewhere specific, hidden, controlled. I folded the list and made a decision Russell would have understood instantly. I'd spent 2 decades in emergency medicine learning that sometimes the most important intervention is stopping what's already being done. I wouldn't give Silas a single pill. Not tonight. Not until I watched him and understood what I was actually looking at. Silas sat in the living room corner through the entire night. Not sleeping, not speaking. Just sitting with his back against the wall, rocking slightly small hands, covering his ears against sounds I couldn't hear. I stayed in the doorway watching the way I used to watch soldiers in triage, observing for signs, for patterns, for the truth beneath what I'd been told. Every 30 minutes I checked on him. He never moved except for that slight rocking motion, that careful pressure of palms against ears. The green notebook stayed clutched in his left hand even while he rocked. Especially while he rocked. When dawn broke through the kitchen windows Friday morning, I made scrambled eggs and toast. Simple food, warm food, the kind Russell used to make for me on mornings when the world felt too heavy. I set the plate on the kitchen table and spoke gently, expecting nothing. "Good morning, sweetheart. I made you breakfast." Silas looked up. For the first time since arriving, he made direct eye contact. His eyes were hazel-clear tracking, with an awareness that contradicted everything about his frozen posture and silence. He pulled a pen from his jacket pocket, that oversized jacket he still wore, despite being inside, despite the house being warm, and reached for the paper napkin beside his plate. The handwriting was perfect. Each letter precisely formed, aligned, deliberate. Not the uncertain scrawl of a child, but the careful script of someone who knew exactly what he wanted to say and had been waiting for the chance to say it. 5 words, no medicine, thank you, Grandma. I stood there holding the edge of the table, reading those 5 words over and over. Not confused, not impaired, not whatever the medication list claimed he needed to suppress. Trapped. Silas had been conscious and aware through everything. Chemically silenced, but fully present. Waiting for someone, anyone, to stop medicating him long enough to see who he actually was beneath the pharmaceutical fog. My hands trembled as I picked up the napkin, the same hands that had once held pressure on arterial wounds under mortar fire in Fallujah, that had sutured soldiers together while explosions shook the tent walls. But they trembled now. "You're welcome, sweetheart," I said. "No medicine, I promise." He nodded once, then picked up the fork and ate his breakfast with the same careful precision his handwriting showed. Every movement deliberate, controlled, like someone who'd learned that survival meant performing normalcy even when nothing was normal. I folded the napkin with its 5 perfect words and slipped it into my pocket. Clayton's phone number sat on the counter where I'd written it, right there beside my coffee mug, easy to reach. My hand didn't reach for the phone. I needed to know more before making any calls. Needed to understand what I was looking at in this silent, brilliant child who'd been chemically silenced for reasons I was just beginning to suspect. Clayton said he'd call Sunday. Fine. Sunday would come and go without me calling him first, because something was very wrong in my son's house. Something that involved 6 medications, midnight abandonments, and an 8-year-old boy who'd been waiting for someone to see him. And I was going to find out what... Sunday came and went without me calling Clayton. So did Monday morning. On the 3rd day after Silas arrived, I walked behind the farmhouse toward Russell's laboratory and stopped cold because the steel door that had been locked for 3 years since my husband's death stood open, 6 inches morning fog, curling through the gap like fingers beckoning me inside. I'd checked that lock 100 times. When Russell died, I'd sealed his workspace exactly as he'd left it, unable to face the dusty shelves of barley samples and the whiteboard covered in equations I couldn't understand. The key hung on a hook in the kitchen, untouched. I pushed the door wider. The hinges groaned a sound that echoed in the November stillness. Inside smelled faintly of chemicals, preserved grain samples, soil analysis solutions, the ghost of work that ended too soon. Weak morning light filtered through high windows, illuminating tall metal shelving that cast long shadows across the concrete floor. Silas stood at the far end of the laboratory, small and perfectly still, before Russell's dust-covered whiteboard. He held a tiny piece of white chalk in his right hand. Silas, how did you get in here? My voice came out sharper than I intended. This door has been locked since your grandfather died. He didn't turn around. His hand moved steadily across the board, erasing one of Russell's old equations, something about protein synthesis, all Greek letters and subscripts, and replacing it with small, flawless biochemical notation. Each symbol was sharp precise. The handwriting of someone who'd practiced these formations thousands of times. It was open when I came outside this morning, he said quietly. That was impossible. I'd walked this path yesterday at dawn and the door was locked. I was certain. Where did you get the chalk? He pointed to the metal filing cabinet against the left wall without turning around. 3rd drawer from the left. I crossed the laboratory and pulled open the 3rd drawer. Inside sat a fresh box of white chalk, still shrink-wrapped completely intact. Supplies Russell had bought and left here, but when, and for whom? The laboratory door had been locked. The chalk was new. Someone had planned this. Someone had given Silas access to this workspace deliberately. I turned back to watch Silas complete the equation. His small hand moved with absolute confidence, writing chemical formulas that most graduate students would struggle to remember. When he finished, he stepped back to examine his work the way Russell used to. Head tilted slightly, assessing whether the logic held. What 8-year-old child completes advanced biochemical equations on a whiteboard with the precision of a doctoral researcher? Not a medicated child, not a chemically suppressed child, not the child Clayton and Paloma claimed needed 6 different drugs just to function. Silas set the chalk down on the metal tray beneath the whiteboard and walked past me without speaking, heading back toward the farmhouse. I let him go, let him disappear around the corner while I stood alone in Russell's laboratory, staring at the equation on the board, understanding less than I wanted to and more than I liked. Russell had left chalk. Russell had prepared this space. But Russell died 3 years before Silas ever set foot on this farm. Unless he'd known, unless he'd planned for exactly this. 2 days later, Wednesday afternoon, I walked to the mailbox at the end of our long dirt road, where Russell had planted apple trees on both sides decades ago. The trees were bare now, branches black against gray November sky. Inside the box seed catalogs a water bill and a thick manila envelope from a Portland law firm. The return address listed Paloma's financial advisory company, but the recipient address was the Bentley farm misdelivered, I realized, because the postal system had matched the shared surname to the closest address it could find. I almost put it back, almost marked it return to sender. Instead, I opened it. Inside were formal creditor notices printed on heavy legal letterhead. Chapter 11, Bankruptcy Warnings, Asset Seizure Timelines. I read the first page standing there between Russell's apple trees, then read it again sitting on the porch steps, then a 3rd time to make sure I understood what I was looking at. Notice of pending asset seizure. I read aloud to the empty porch. 60 days to file restructuring plan or personal guarantees will be executed. Paloma's company wasn't managing a business downturn, it was collapsing. The documents detailed creditor claims, frozen accounts, outstanding debt to investment partners who were demanding immediate repayment. Personal assets would be seized if bankruptcy restructuring wasn't filed within 60 days. The letter was dated 2 weeks ago, the same week Clayton had shown up in a midnight rainstorm with Silas and a crumpled medication list. An urgent business trip. Just a few days. We'll call you Sunday. 2 weeks had passed. Not a single phone call. They aren't on a business trip, I said to the November air. They're not busy. They're running. Running from creditors. Running from asset seizure. Running from the collapse of whatever financial empire Paloma had built and Clayton had helped sustain with his law practice. And they needed somewhere to hide Silas while they figured out how to survive. I folded the bankruptcy notice carefully, my hands steadier than they should have been. Combat nursing teaches you how to stay calm while reading death sentences. This felt similar. Different victim, same finality. Silas was inconvenient to their collapsing empire. A child who required attention and resources they couldn't spare. A child they couldn't afford to have asking questions or drawing attention while they tried to salvage their finances. So they'd medicated him into silence. Hidden him at a farm 2 hours south of Portland, given him to the mother Clayton had just expelled from his mansion, because who would question a grandmother taking care of her grandson, who would look twice at an arrangement that seemed perfectly normal from the outside? I walked back to the farmhouse and set the papers on the kitchen counter beside the medication list I'd never filled. The afternoon light slanted through the windows, catching dust particles in golden shafts. Silas sat in the living room with his green notebook open on his lap, writing something I couldn't see from this angle. Still silent, still careful, still waiting to see if I'd betray him the way everyone else had. I understood now what I was looking at. Silas wasn't what they were trying to escape from. Silas was what they needed to hide while they sorted out their financial disaster, hide him from view. Keep him quiet, make sure no one asked questions about the brilliant child they'd been systematically suppressing. The question that kept me awake that night was simple and impossible: why? The answer came the following evening, though I didn't recognize it as an answer at first. 14 days with Silas, and I'd learned that the boy's silence wasn't an absence, but a presence. By that November evening, I knew I was right. I stood at the farmhouse sink washing dinner dishes while darkness pressed against the windows. Warm yellow light made the kitchen feel smaller, intimate. The scent of dish soap mixed with baked apples, and in the next room the wood stove ticked as the fire burned down. Silas sat at the kitchen table in his usual corner chair with the green notebook open before him. I'd fallen into the habit of talking to myself while I worked the way widows do when loneliness becomes conversation. Russell always said the Eastern Plot had the best drainage. I said to the soapy water, to the darkness, to the ghost of my husband who'd been gone 3 years. That's why the barley grew so well there, why he chose it for the experimental strains. I scrubbed a plate that was already clean. I should have kept planting it. He would have wanted me to keep the work going, not let it all turn to wild grass and thistle. The plate went into the drying rack. I picked up a cup. But I didn't know what I was doing without you to show me. I said quieter. I didn't know which seeds to plant or when to harvest or how to read the soil the way you did. Silas's voice cut through the quiet kitchen, not loud but clear, slightly raspy from long disuse. Grandpa planted barley in the Eastern Plot. Why don't you plant it anymore? The cup clattered against the metal sink. I gripped the counter, my heart hammering the way it used to when mortars fell too close to the field hospital. A child's voice in a house that had held only silence and the widow's solitary thoughts. The sound rewrote the entire shape of the evening in one instant. I turned slowly. Silas sat at the table looking directly at me, making eye contact for only the second time since he'd arrived. Not staring at the floor, not hiding. Looking at me with full attention, his question hanging in the air. The medication hadn't been treating a speech disorder. It had been suppressing a fully functional mind. Silas, I managed. How do you know about the Eastern Plot? He blinked once. The pen rested in his small hand. You've never been to this farm before 2 weeks ago, I continued. You couldn't have seen the eastern fields. How do you know what your grandfather planted there? I read Grandpa's journals, he said. 4 words, simple, devastating. I crossed the kitchen and sat down across from him slowly. My nurse's training kicked in. Observe, assess, don't overwhelm the patient who's just shown you something important. Which journals? I asked quietly. The ones about barley genetics. Silas said, his voice soft but articulate. He wrote about the Eastern plot in Volume 7, about the soil composition and the irrigation system he built in 2015, about the new hybrid he was developing that could tolerate salt stress better than commercial varieties. Volume 7. Russell had kept his research journals in numbered sequence, all stored in the laboratory filing cabinet. I hadn't opened that cabinet since the day he died. Where did you read these journals? Silas looked down at his notebook. At home, in Portland. Someone gave them to you. He nodded. Who? Silas pressed his lips together and shook his head slightly. Not defiant, not refusing, uncertain, or afraid. I let that question rest, pushed it aside the way you set aside a scalpel when you need a different instrument. What else did you read in Grandpa's journals? Everything. Silas said simply. Volumes 1 through 12. He wrote about barley genetics and protein synthesis and drought resistance. He wrote about the Vance grain hybrid he created using saltwater-tolerant genes from wild grass species. He wrote that it was the most important work he'd ever done and that nobody could know about it until the patent was secure. Vance grain. I'd heard Russell mention that name once or twice in his final months, always with careful secrecy, but he died before explaining it to me. Who gives an 8-year-old child access to agricultural research journals kept on a farm 300 miles from where he lives? The kind of person who knows what that child is capable of understanding. The kind of person who's preparing him for something specific. The kind of person who has access to research that was supposed to be secret. Silas. I said carefully, those journals were here at the farm, in Grandpa's laboratory. They never left this property. So if you read them in Portland, someone brought them to me, he finished. Who, again that small headshake, either he didn't know or he was protecting someone. Thank you for telling me, I said quietly. We'll figure this out together, okay. Silas nodded once and returned to his notebook, the conversation apparently complete. I walked back to the sink and stared out the dark window at my own reflection. The journals were here at the farm, stored in the laboratory, never taken to Portland. That meant someone had given them to Silas, someone who had access to Russell's research, someone who knew what Silas was capable of understanding, someone who was preparing him. Someone had given my grandson access to Russell's classified agricultural research. Someone had taught him to understand complex genetic science before he was 9 years old. Someone had prepared him to come to this farm and continue Russell's work. And then Clayton and Paloma had tried to chemically erase all of it. The question wasn't when or where. The question was who gave him those journals when he was living in Portland 300 miles away, and what else had they given him that I hadn't discovered yet? That night, I got part of my answer about who had been preparing Silas. The rest would take longer to understand. I stood on the back porch in my nightgown at 11:30, watching a small beam of light flicker from behind the farmhouse, Silas's flashlight, moving with purpose toward the laboratory door. I grabbed my own flashlight and followed barefoot across the cold November grass dew, soaking the hem of my nightgown. The laboratory door stood open again. Inside, Silas waited in the darkness, his small flashlight beam pointed at the concrete floor in the right corner. "Press here, Grandma," he said quietly, pointing at a floor tile. "It opens." I knelt and examined the tile he indicated. Unlike every other tile in the laboratory, this one was completely free of dust, clean as though someone had wiped it yesterday, not 3 years ago when Russell died. I pressed down hard on the tile's center. Something clicked beneath my palm. A spring mechanism activated with a sound like an old lock releasing. The tile lifted slightly on hidden hinges, revealing a wooden staircase descending into darkness below. Russell had built a cellar beneath the laboratory, a hidden cellar I'd never known existed in 30 years of living on this farm. I descended the stairs with Silas close behind me, our flashlights cutting narrow paths through the darkness. At the bottom, I found a switch and flipped it. Fluorescent lights flickered on. The cellar was small, maybe 10 feet by 12, with concrete walls and a low ceiling. Against the left wall stood a refrigerator still humming quietly. The sound stopped me cold. That refrigerator was running. 3 years after Russell's death, something was keeping it powered. I opened the door. Inside were sealed containers with plant samples carefully labeled in Russell's handwriting, with dates and genetic sequence codes. The containers were cold preserved, maintained by a backup battery system Russell had installed specifically for this purpose. He'd designed this space to survive his death, designed it to preserve his work for someone to discover, for me to discover. On a small wooden desk sat an old computer displaying a screensaver of barley fields swaying in wind. Beside it rested a thick, leather-bound notebook, Russell's research journal. I picked up the journal with hands that remembered holding Russell's hand during his final week, the morphine haze, the careful way he'd squeezed my fingers when he couldn't speak anymore. This was his handwriting, his work, his voice from beyond the grave. I opened to the final page dated August 14th, 2019, 3 months before he died. Vance Grain patent, complete. I read aloud. Do not file yet. Wait for Lorraine. She will know when. The handwriting was clear, certain, as if he knew he wouldn't be here to explain, but trusted I would understand when the time came. Russell, I whispered to the empty cellar. What were you preparing for? What did you see coming? No answer came, just the quiet hum of the refrigerator preserving samples for work that wasn't finished yet. I carried the journal upstairs through the cold November air back into the farmhouse. Silas followed silently, returning to his bedroom without a word. I sat at the kitchen table under a single small light and began reading. Russell's handwriting hadn't changed in 20 years, the same precise letters he'd used to write grocery lists and birthday cards, now recording instructions for a future he knew he wouldn't see. The journal detailed 15 years of agricultural research. Vance Grain, a specialized barley strain. Russell had engineered to grow in saline-damaged soil. Land poisoned by saltwater intrusion, drought industrial runoff land, where traditional crops failed and entire farming communities collapsed. Page after page documented genetic modifications, field trials, protein synthesis analysis. Russell had been building something revolutionary, something that could change agriculture in regions where soil degradation meant starvation. But the patent wasn't filed. The research wasn't complete. On page 32, I found the problem Russell couldn't solve. He'd written in red ink, underlining twice. Final sequence requires pattern recognition beyond standard computational analysis. Someone who can read the biological structure like a language, not just data. Cannot complete alone. I read through the night. Cold coffee sat forgotten beside my elbow as November rain tapped against the kitchen windows. Outside, darkness slowly gave way to gray pre-dawn light. At 7:15 in the morning, my phone vibrated on the table. Clayton's number. I watched it ring once, twice, 3 times, 4 times. I never reached for it. 4 rings, I said aloud to the empty kitchen. I'm not calling you back, Clayton. Not until I understand what you're really after. The phone went silent. No voicemail. He'd try again, I knew, but not yet. Not while he was still dealing with whatever financial crisis had sent him running. Footsteps sounded in the hallway. Silas walked into the kitchen wearing the same oversized jacket he'd arrived in 2 weeks ago, his green notebook tucked under his arm. He sat down across from me at the table without speaking. I looked at him, this 8-year-old child who'd been chemically suppressed, systematically silenced, hidden on a farm, while his parents fled their collapsing empire. This child, who could complete advanced biochemical equations and had read 15 years of agricultural research journals that should have been incomprehensible to someone his age. What 8-year-old child looks at 15 years of agricultural biotechnology research and says they know the missing piece with the calm certainty of someone who's already solved it in their head? Silas opened his green notebook to a page covered in his careful handwriting equations, diagrams, notes, written in margins. He turned it so I could see. "I know what the missing piece is," he said quietly. 4 words spoken with absolute certainty. I looked down at his notebook at Russell's journal open beside my cold coffee at the gray November dawn light filtering through the kitchen windows. I'd read 47 pages of research documentation through the night. I had an 8-year-old grandson who claimed to know the scientific answer Russell died searching for. And I had 90 days, probably fewer, before Clayton realized something was happening at the farm and took action. Before he understood what Russell had built and what Silas could complete. Before he came back not to hide his son, but to take what Russell had protected. The question wasn't whether to move forward. The question was how fast we could work before time ran out. We started working on Russell's research the next afternoon. No discussion necessary. Silas simply waited by the back door after lunch until I put on my coat. December arrived at the Oregon farm with morning frost and days that shortened by the hour, and Silas and I began walking down to the cellar every afternoon, a new routine no one had explicitly spoken into existence, but both understood was necessary. That first afternoon in the secret cellar, I brought down a small portable whiteboard and set it on the desk beside Russell's computer. Silas stood before it, holding a black marker studying the final equation from the journal Russell had left unfinished. I'd expected technical terminology, scientific jargon that would require me to reference Russell's notes just to follow along. Instead, Silas's voice came out small but steady, explaining in a language I could understand. "This part here," he said, pointing to a section of the equation that looked like ancient Greek to me. "Grandpa was trying to make the seed remember the way home even if the soil has changed." I leaned closer. Like navigation. Like the seed knowing which direction to grow. "Like you remembering the way back to this farm after 30 years, Silas said. I looked back at the equation. Something about the protein synthesis notation pulled at the edge of my nursing instincts, a sequence I'd seen in a different context in a different laboratory years ago. Not agricultural, medical. But the memory slipped before I could catch it, and Silas was already moving to the next section. He turned to look at me directly, those hazel eyes clear and focused. "The soil changed, but the way home stayed the same inside you." The metaphor landed with perfect clarity. Russell's work wasn't just about salt-tolerant genes or protein synthesis. It was about teaching plants to survive in environments that should kill them, giving them the biological memory to find resources even when everything around them had changed. I'd lived in 7 different cities during my Army career, deployed twice to war zones where nothing looked familiar. But I'd always known the way back to this farm, the way back to Russell, even when decades passed between visits. The internal compass never shifted. That's what Russell had been engineering into barley seeds, an internal compass that could navigate poisoned soil. Genius, I realize, doesn't always speak in equations and technical specifications. Sometimes it speaks in the language of gardens and memory and finding your way home through changed soil. "Show me what Russell was missing," I said quietly. Silas turned back to the whiteboard and began writing. Not the halting scrawl of a child, but precise notation that flowed like he was copying something he'd already completed in his mind. The marker squeaked against the board as he filled in gaps Russell had left, blank added sequences Russell hadn't lived long enough to discover, completed connections Russell had suspected but couldn't prove. I watched my 8-year-old grandson finish 15 years of agricultural biotechnology research in 40 minutes. When he set down the marker, I understood what Russell had meant by waiting for someone who could read biological structure like a language. Silas didn't compute the patterns. He felt them. Understood them the way some people understand music or poetry, not through analysis, but through intuition that ran deeper than conscious thought. "That's it," Silas said simply. "That's what Grandpa needed." I pulled out my phone and photographed the whiteboard from 3 different angles, making sure every symbol was clear and legible. Evidence, documentation, proof that Russell's work was completable and that my grandson was the only person who could complete it. 2 weeks passed. Every afternoon we descended into the cellar together. Every evening we came back up as December. Darkness fell earlier and earlier. I'd started checking on Silas before bed, a habit I hadn't noticed forming until it was already there. Something about the silence of the farmhouse at night, the way it echoed with Russell's absence, made me need to see Silas breathing safe real. Mid-December, I entered his small bedroom around 11 p.m. and found him fast asleep with the green notebook open on his chest. The nightlight cast soft shadows across his face. He looked younger in sleep, more vulnerable. I carefully lifted the notebook so it wouldn't wake him. I'd assumed it contained drawings or random notes or the kind of scribbling children do when they're processing the world. What I found froze me in place. Every single page represented a day, the date written in careful longhand at the top starting months before he'd arrived at the farm, medication names in precise block capitals, dosages exact to the milligram, Silas's bodily reactions recorded hour by hour in clinical detail, serial numbers from medication bottles copied down in full. I turned pages with hands that had stopped trembling. Day 1, risperidone 2 milligrams morning. Clonidine 0.1 milligrams evening. Hands shake. Can't remember breakfast. Day 12, added guanfacine. Serial number B47-9823. Everything feels far away. Mom says I'm calmer. Day 23, sertraline increased. Can't read for more than 10 minutes. Used to read 2 hours. Page after page, month after month. The flawless scientific record of a child tracking his own poisoning in the only way he knew how. What kind of 8-year-old child documents his own chemical suppression in perfect clinical notation, tracking serial numbers and dosages and cognitive decline with the precision of a research scientist, because he understands no one else will save him? I reached the final entry, the ink still relatively wet from recent writing. Day 18 at Grandma's farm, no medicine, I remember 47% more. He'd quantified his own recovery, measured his returning cognitive function with the same clinical detachment he'd used to document his suppression, because no adult had protected him, no adult had believed him, so he'd created evidence himself in the only language he trusted, data documentation, irrefutable scientific record. I set the notebook down carefully beside his sleeping form and sat in the chair next to his bed, watching him breathe in the dim glow of his nightlight. 20 years as a combat nurse, I'd seen terrible things. Soldiers torn apart by explosives, children caught in crossfire who'd never asked for war, medics who worked 36-hour shifts trying to save people who couldn't be saved. But this was the first time I wanted to go to court, not to defend myself, but to destroy every single person who had done this to a child. The medication list with its 6 chemical restraints, the bankruptcy papers proving Clayton and Paloma had hidden him during their collapse, the green notebook with 47 pages of clinical self-documentation that would make any family court judge understand exactly what had been done. I had evidence now, real evidence. Documentation that would stand up in court recorded by the victim himself with scientific precision that couldn't be disputed. The question was who to call first. The question of who to call first was answered by sunrise. I woke at 5:30, a military habit that never faded, and sat in front of the telephone at my small farmhouse office desk until 7 o'clock before dialing the green notebook open beside my cold coffee. Ellen Stratford answered on the second ring. She was the family attorney who'd guided me through Russell's estate paperwork 3 years ago, patient and thorough, in a way that made complicated legal processes feel manageable. I heard her shift papers on the other end of the line as I spoke. I kept my voice calm and clinical the way I used to report battlefield casualties, letting the evidence speak for itself. The medication list with 6 drugs prescribed to chemically suppress an 8-year-old. The bankruptcy papers proving Clayton and Paloma had hidden Silas during their financial collapse. The green notebook with 47 pages documenting systematic poisoning in perfect scientific notation. Ellen remained silent for a long moment after I finished. Then she spoke with the careful precision of someone delivering news that would hurt. Under ORS 109.119, you can petition for third-party custody if you prove an established relationship with Silas and Clayton's parental unfitness, she said. But Lorraine, the court begins with a presumption in favor of biological parents. You'll be fighting uphill from the start. I have documentation, I said, evidence that can't be disputed. I believe you. Ellen paused. I heard her take a breath. But I need you to understand what you're walking into. They will use your military history against you, your PTSD therapy records from 2010 to 2013. Are you prepared for that exposure? My hands tightened on the phone. Those records documented the worst months of my life after returning from Afghanistan, the nightmares that woke me screaming, the hypervigilance that made grocery stores feel like combat zones, the 18 months of therapy, learning to function again, to sleep through the night, to exist in a world without mortar fire. To save this child, I would have to stand in an Oregon courtroom and let strangers examine the nights I couldn't sleep after Kandahar, the months of therapy, learning to function again, every psychological scar I'd worked so hard to heal. I have the evidence, Ellen, I said quietly. A child tracked his own chemical suppression for months because no adult would protect him. Let them use whatever they want against me. Then we fight, Ellen said. I'll start the paperwork today. Expect this to get ugly fast once Clayton realizes what's happening. We talked for another 20 minutes about timelines and documentation and what court proceedings would look like. When I hung up, the winter sun had risen over the eastern barley fields Russell used to tend. I had started a war. There was no turning back now. 3 weeks into December late afternoon, as winter light faded early, I walked to the farm gate at the end of the long dirt road. I'd seen the gray pickup truck parked there for weeks, now caught glimpses of someone watching, taking notes, sitting in the cab with a thermos of coffee while pretending not to be surveilling my property. After Ellen's call, I was done with mysteries. The truck sat in its usual spot where Russell's apple trees gave way to County Road. I walked right up to the driver's window and knocked. Hard. The man inside lifted his head, mid-50s, wearing a baseball cap pulled low. When he removed it, I saw a familiar small shrapnel scar cutting across his left ear, the kind of injury that comes from being too close to an explosion. Lorraine Bentley, he said, and his voice carried the weight of someone who'd been waiting for this moment. Russell said I'd find you here when you needed me. The laboratory door, I said suddenly. 3 weeks ago, it was locked, then opened the next morning. Silas said it was open when he went outside. Was that you? Stewart reached into his jacket pocket and held up a small brass key. Russell gave it to me in 2018, said if I ever saw the boy arrive at the farm, I should open the lab the night before, let the child find it on his own terms. Russell's words exactly. He set the key on the truck seat between us. I drove down the night Silas arrived, opened it around 3 a.m., put the chalk in the drawer the way Russell asked. Russell's name stopped me cold. Who are you? I demanded. And how do you know my husband's name? He opened the truck door slowly, hands visible the way you move, when you understand the person in front of you has combat training. Stuart Harrington, 58. With that shrapnel scar and careful movements that spoke of shared experience, said Russell's name like a password I'd been waiting 3 years to hear. Stuart Harrington, he said. Private investigator, former Army medic, served in the same unit as Russell in Germany back in 1988, before you met him. I studied his face, the scar, the way he held himself, the truth in his eyes. Russell asked you to watch me, I said. Not you. Stewart reached into the truck and pulled out a manila folder thick with documents. He asked me to watch the situation, to keep tabs on Clayton. When I saw the bankruptcy filings hit the Portland courthouse records last month, I knew it was time to make contact. How long? I asked. I've been trailing your son Clayton for 18 months. 18 months, the number hit me like a physical blow. What did Russell see or suspect 18 months before his death that made him hire a private investigator to watch his own son? Russell knew something was wrong, I said slowly, even before he got sick. Russell knew a lot of things, Stewart said. He was dying when he called me. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, maybe 3 months left. He said his son was planning something that would put you and his research in danger. Asked me to watch, to document, to make contact when you needed help. I looked at the folder in Stuart's hands at the gray pickup truck he'd been sitting in for weeks at the man Russell had trusted enough to hire as a guardian from beyond the grave. "What did you find in 18 months?" I asked. "Everything," Stuart said simply. "Bank records showing Clayton's involvement with Paloma's firm, shell companies, asset transfers, and a 2020 academic paper proving he knew about Russell's research long before you did." He held out the folder. "Russell said when you were ready, you'd come ask me. Took you 3 weeks. A slight smile crossed his face. "He said it would take you about that long. Said you'd need to gather your own evidence first before trusting anyone else's." I took the folder. It was heavy packed with documentation. "Russell asked me to watch Clayton for 18 months before he died," I said. "That means he knew something was coming as early as 2018, more than a year before he passed away." "He knew," Stuart confirmed, "and he prepared. The cellar, the journals, the backup power for the refrigerator, and me, he prepared all of it. Russell hadn't just left me research. He'd left me an army." Inside the farmhouse, Stuart followed me to the dining table and opened his laptop, spreading 18 months of surveillance files across the wood's surface like evidence at a crime scene. I was looking at the anatomy of a betrayal that had been carefully planned for years. Stuart worked methodically, one document at a time, building the complete picture. "Bank statements first," he said, sliding papers toward me. "Paloma's company borrowed $8 million from 4 different sources over the past 18 months. Look at the collateral she listed: shell company assets that don't exist, all smoke and mirrors." I scanned the numbers. $8 million borrowed against nothing. This is where it gets worse. He pulled out legal paperwork with notary stamps. Clayton transferred Silas's inheritance rights, the trust Russell set up for his grandson, to an anonymous LLC registered in Delaware, filed 6 months ago. 6 months ago. While I was being expelled from Clayton's mansion, Silas was being medicated into silence, and his financial future was being stolen. "And this," Stuart said quietly, "this is why Russell called me." It was an academic paper from the Journal of Agricultural Biotechnology, March 2020. The author section listed Russell Bentley, the Oregon farm location, and an abstract describing a salt-tolerant barley strain in final development stages. Estimated agricultural impact revolutionary. 2 years ago. 2 full years before Clayton showed up with Silas in a midnight rainstorm. Clayton already knew about his father's work. Vernon had kept him informed since 2015. But this publication changed everything. Stuart said, tapping the journal. Before, the research existed only in private files. After March 2020, it was public record. Citable, verifiable, worth exponentially more the moment any agricultural company could confirm it was real. Clayton watched the valuation grow. Then when Paloma's company started collapsing last year, he moved. I stared at the paper, thinking of all the phone calls Clayton had made over the past 2 years, checking how I was doing, asking about the farm, suggesting I move in with him so I wouldn't be lonely. Every conversation had been a calculation. 2 years of patients calling to check on me, asking about the farm, playing the dutiful son, while he waited for his father's research to reach maximum value before striking. Every phone call, I said. Every time he asked about the farm, he was waiting and watching like a predator. "That's exactly what he was doing," Stuart confirmed. "Russell suspected it. That's why he hired me. He knew Clayton had seen this paper, knew his son was waiting for him to die so the research could be claimed without opposition." Russell died in November 2019. Clayton has been planning this since March 2020. "At minimum," Stuart said. "The pattern is clear. Clayton identified valuable research, waited for optimal timing, then moved to control both the child who could complete it and the property where it was developed." I walked to the kitchen window, looking out at December darkness settling over the barley fields. Russell had seen this coming, had understood his own son well enough to know what was waiting. And he'd prepared, not just the cellar and journals, an entire defense system. 3 weeks into January, Silas and I sat in the secret cellar finalizing the USPTO provisional patent application. Stuart had walked me through every section, and Silas had provided the technical specifications. A provisional patent gave us a priority date 12 months to file the full patent while securing our claim to the intellectual property. I reviewed the email transmission on the old computer screen, checking recipients one final time. National Institute of Agricultural Biotechnology, USPTO filing system, Ellen Stratford. Then I noticed an additional email address in the CC field that I hadn't added. Silas, I said carefully, whose email address is this? I didn't add anyone else to the transmission. Silas looked up from his green notebook. Mine, he said simply. I sent the Institute the intermediate results 3 weeks ago to secure a timestamp for intellectual property proof. I stood frozen. You created legal evidence 3 weeks ago. My voice came out barely above a whisper. Before I even called Ellen. Yes, Silas said calmly. If someone tries to contest ownership of Grandpa's research, the Institute's timestamp will serve as independent third-party verification of when the work was completed and by whom. When did you send it? I asked. Silas pulled out his notebook and flipped to a page near the front. The date at the top, December 28th, 2022. 21 days ago, before I'd fully understood what we were fighting, before I'd called Ellen Stratford, before Stuart Harrington had revealed himself at the farm gate. Silas had been protecting us legally while I was still gathering courage to make phone calls. You did this on your own, I said. Without telling me. You had enough to worry about, Silas said quietly. I saw Grandpa's research notes about patent filing. I understood we needed proof of completion date before anyone could challenge us, so I created it. I sat down slowly, looking at my grandson who'd spent months tracking his own poisoning with clinical precision because he understood no adult would save him. He'd been right, and he'd prepared for it. Thank you, I said. Silas nodded once and returned to his notebook, the conversation complete from his perspective. But I sat there for a long time staring at that email timestamp, understanding that the child I'd been trying to protect had been protecting me just as fiercely. Planning moves I hadn't conceived of yet, creating legal ammunition for a war I'd barely begun to fight. A timestamp dated 21 days ago, before I knew about the patent, before I'd called Ellen Stratford, before Stuart Harrington revealed himself at the farm gate. Silas had been protecting us legally before I'd even opened my eyes to what was happening, an 8-year-old child who'd learned that if you want to survive, you document everything and you plan 3 moves ahead of everyone hunting you. The question was no longer whether we could fight Clayton. The question was how fast we could move before he realized what was building against him. The war started with a phone call 2 months later. March arrived at the Oregon farm with warming spring rain and the first green shoots breaking through soil in the eastern plot. On a Tuesday afternoon at 3 o'clock, my phone vibrated in my pocket while Silas and I stood in the cellar reviewing the final data compilation. Dr. Marcus Sheffield, director of the National Institute of Agricultural Biotechnology, delivered his verdict in the measured tone of a scientist who understood he was describing something that could reshape global agriculture. Mrs. Bentley laboratory testing confirms Vance grain represents a paradigm shift in salt-tolerant agriculture, he said. We're looking at 40% of the world's damaged soil becoming viable again. Regions that haven't grown crops in decades could support full agricultural production. I climbed the cellar stairs and walked to the kitchen, sinking into a chair as Dr. Sheffield continued. The Institute proposes a provisional license agreement, he said. Not an outright purchase, but a conditional licensing arrangement while the full patent processes through USPTO. The value we're proposing is $47 million structured in milestone payments upon patent approval plus a 2% royalty per hectare, deployed globally. $47 million. The number was too large to fully comprehend. Russell had built something in this soil, in this cellar, working alone for 15 years, and it was worth enough to change everything. This is unprecedented, Mrs. Bentley. Dr. Sheffield continued. We'll need your signature on preliminary agreements, but I wanted you to hear the evaluation results first. Your husband's work could feed millions. After I hung up, I sat staring at the kitchen table. Silas stepped out from the doorway where he'd been listening. He sat down beside me without a word and took my hand the first time he'd initiated physical contact since arriving 5 months ago. $47 million, Silas, I whispered. Your grandfather built something that could feed millions. Silas squeezed my hand gently. They'll come for us now. He was right. $47 million meant Silas wasn't just a brilliant child to protect. He was a fortune to control, and men who hunted fortunes were far more dangerous than fathers who abandoned their sons. 1 week later, the Oregon Agricultural Journal published their feature early Wednesday morning. The headline read, "Oregon Widow and Grandson Finalize Agricultural Work That Could Transform Global Food Security." The article included a photograph the reporter had taken during our farm interview, Silas and me standing in front of the farmhouse, the boy holding his green notebook, looking straight into the camera lens with those steady hazel eyes. Stuart Harrington called at 8 a.m., his voice tight with urgency. Lorraine, I just got word through my courthouse contacts. Clayton hired Fletcher and Associates last night. They're the most aggressive family law firm in Portland. They'll file a custody petition within 48 hours. Get ready. I looked at the newspaper photo on my laptop screen at Silas's calm gaze staring back at me. We knew this was coming, Stuart, I said. Ellen has everything prepared. The green notebook, the surveillance files, everything. Lorraine, there's something else. Stuart's voice carried a warning I'd learned to recognize. The firm Clayton hired, they don't usually handle simple custody cases. They handle complex asset litigation disguised as family law. Asset litigation. Not a father fighting for his son. A lawyer fighting for control of $47 million. So it begins, I said. So it begins, Stuart confirmed. That night at 11 p.m., just as I finished rereading Ellen's legal strategy documents in bed, my phone vibrated with an unknown number, showing a Portland area code. I answered warily, "Hello. Mrs. Bentley, I apologize for calling so late." The voice was older, educated, carrying the particular polite coldness of someone speaking from an established position of power. Vernon Garrett spoke with academic precision at 62 years old, claiming a family connection that Russell had never once mentioned in 20 years of marriage. I am Professor Vernon Garrett. I sat up straight against my pillows. I believe we need to discuss your grandson before this situation escalates beyond everyone's control. He continued smoothly. You see, you're interfering with something you don't fully understand, Mrs. Bentley. This isn't merely a family custody dispute. This is a matter of science. The way he said science made my skin crawl, like Silas was a laboratory specimen rather than a child. Who are you? I demanded. Why do you think you have any right to call me about Silas? I'm Russell's brother, Mrs. Bentley, Vernon Garrett said calmly, and Eli is as much my family as yours. Russell's brother. The words hit me like a physical blow. In 20 years of marriage, through birthdays, holidays, late-night conversations about family history, the quiet intimacy of 2 decades together, Russell had never once mentioned a brother named Vernon. Not a single time. Russell didn't have a brother, I said. I assure you he did. Vernon's voice stayed perfectly calm, perfectly controlled. We were estranged for many years due to professional disagreements. But family is family, Mrs. Bentley. And blood matters particularly when it comes to exceptional genetics. Exceptional genetics. He was talking about Silas like a breeding experiment. Don't call here again, I said. Mrs. Bentley, I'm trying to help you understand the situation before it becomes unpleasant. Eli requires specialized care, specialized monitoring. You're a combat nurse, not a geneticist. You don't understand what you're dealing with. His name is Silas, I said coldly. And this conversation is over. I hung up before he could respond. Eli. The name sat wrong in my chest like a splinter I couldn't locate. Not Silas Eli. Stuart would confirm it 3 days later when I called him. Subject Eli was the research designation Vernon's foundation had assigned before Silas was born. Not a name. A catalog number wearing a human face. What kind of brother never gets mentioned once in 20 years of marriage, never appears at a funeral, never sends a card or makes a call until a $47 million patent suddenly surfaces? I lay in the dark replaying Vernon Garrett's words, his tone, his claim. Russell's brother. In 20 years of marriage, Russell had never mentioned a brother named Vernon. Not once. And Vernon had called Silas by a different name, Eli. Not the name on his birth certificate, not the name Lorraine had used for 8 months. A different name entirely. Tomorrow morning I would call Stuart and demand to know everything he'd learned about Professor Vernon Garrett in those 18 months of surveillance. Because something was very wrong about a man who claimed to be Russell's brother, who knew Silas by a name I'd never heard, and who talked about my grandson like a science experiment. Clayton wasn't the mastermind. He was just the instrument of something far darker. I called Stuart at dawn about Vernon Garrett, but the answers would have to wait. 3 days after the article published War came to the front door. Paloma Bentley arrived at the farm completely alone on a Saturday morning. No Clayton, no lawyer, no witnesses wearing jeans, and a casual sweater, instead of her usual designer armor. Her face arranged in an expression I recognized from 20 years of nursing, carefully practiced remorse that never quite reached the eyes. I opened the door and let her in. This was a performance. "Lorraine, I'm so sorry," Paloma said. "We were wrong. Can we talk about Silas?" "Of course," I said, pouring tea. "Sit down." I positioned my small black digital audio recorder on the kitchen table directly next to the pencil holder, the same recorder I used for making notes. It sat openly visible, a small black rectangle Paloma could plainly see. Under Oregon law, recording with a clearly visible device inside your own residence is entirely legal. I checked with Ellen 3 times. Paloma sat down, her eyes scanning the room with calculating precision, rather than maternal concern. "How is Silas doing?" she asked. "Thriving, actually," I said. "That's wonderful." She set down her teacup. "Which room does he sleep in? I'd like to picture him settling in here." I topped up her tea. "The small bedroom on the east side. Gets good morning light." "And where exactly is Russell's laboratory located?" Her eyes tracked to the window. "I remember you mentioning it once." "Behind the farmhouse," I said. "About 50 yards past the herb garden." "I see." Paloma's fingers traced the rim of her teacup. "You mentioned a cellar once, too. Where's the entrance? Not how is Silas sleeping. Not is he eating well. Not is he happy. Just locations, asset locations." "The cellar entrance is in the laboratory's right corner," I said pleasantly. "The plant samples are refrigerated there. Would you like to see where Silas works on his grandfather's research?" "That would be lovely," Paloma said, but she didn't move to stand. She was gathering intelligence, not visiting her stepson. Paloma asked about the cellar location, the laboratory equipment, the sleeping arrangements, but never once asked how Silas was sleeping, whether he was eating well, if he was happy. Never once asked to see him. Just asset reconnaissance disguised as family concern, all recorded on a device she could see, but apparently didn't think mattered. After she left 40 minutes later, I stopped the recorder and made 3 backup copies, evidence for Ellen Stewart and the court. 2 days later, on Monday morning, I walked to the mailbox at the end of the long dirt road where March mud had made the path treacherous. Among the catalogs and bills sat a thick certified envelope from Oregon County Family Court. I stood there in the cold, holding it, knowing what was inside. This was the moment Stewart had warned about. I tore it open. Clayton's formal custody petition, supported by 3 meticulously documented arguments that made my hands shake. First, I lacked any valid caregiver authorization affidavit for Silas. True on paper, Clayton had never formally granted me guardianship when he dumped his son on my porch in a midnight rainstorm. Second, the farm environment lacked specialized medical facilities necessary for a child with exceptional needs. A lie that would sound compelling to a judge who didn't know Silas's needs were invented through chemical suppression. Third, the weapon they'd been preparing. I had a documented history of post-traumatic stress disorder requiring psychiatric treatment from 2010 through 2013, following my combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. I read that paragraph 3 times. Respondent has documented history of post-traumatic stress disorder psychiatric treatment 2010 to 2013 following combat deployment in Iraq and Afghanistan. Medical records indicate ongoing struggle with combat-related psychological disorder, raising concerns about respondents' capacity to provide stable caregiving environment. What kind of son uses his mother's combat trauma, the nights she stayed awake holding pressure on soldiers' wounds under mortar fire, as a weapon to steal his own child for money? The initial hearing was scheduled exactly 60 days out, May 2023. This wasn't a hastily filed emergency petition. This was a weaponized legal assault built over months designed to use my own service wounds as ammunition. Ellen had warned me. She'd said they would use my therapy records. I just hadn't understood how much it would hurt to see it in writing. They're going to use Kandahar, I whispered to the empty road. Use the field hospital. Use every night I couldn't sleep. Everything. I walked back to the farmhouse holding the summons in hands that had once performed emergency field surgery under artillery bombardment. The same hands that had saved lives were now evidence of unfitness. Inside, Silas sat at the kitchen table working in his green notebook. He looked up as I entered. It came, he said, not a question. It came, I confirmed. He closed his notebook. What did they use? Iraq, my PTSD, the therapy records. Silas nodded once. We knew they would. Ellen prepared counter-arguments. My medical documentation proves their needs claim is fabricated. The green notebook proves systematic suppression. Your PTSD therapy shows you sought help and completed treatment that's strength, not weakness. 8 years old and coaching me through psychological warfare. I sat down across from him. They're going to make me testify about Kandahar, I said. About the nights I couldn't sleep. About everything I fought to overcome. Then we make sure the court sees what they did to me first, Silas said quietly. Before they examine your fitness, they examine theirs. He was right. If they wanted to examine my psychological wounds, we would make sure the court examined what they'd done to Silas, first 47 pages of clinical documentation showing systematic chemical suppression of a child. Inside the house, Silas was waiting. He always seemed to know when something had shifted, sat straighter, closed his notebook, watched the door. I set the summons on the counter between us without a word. He read it once, top to bottom, and handed it back. We knew they would, he said. Yes, I said. We did. 2 weeks later, I had to prove they were wrong about me. The psychologist's office in Salem was a 45-minute drive through April rain that drummed against the windshield like incoming rounds. I kept both hands steady on the wheel the same way I'd kept them steady holding scalpels under mortar fire. Because if I was going to win this war, I had to walk into that clean white room and let a stranger examine every psychological scar I'd spent years learning to carry. Dr. Andrea Cole, the court-appointed psychologist assigned to evaluate my fitness, sat with professional neutrality across a small table in an office that smelled of lavender and new carpet. A voice recorder sat on the desk between us. This session is being recorded, she said, for the court record. I nodded. Everything was evidence now. Dr. Cole opened a manila folder. Tell me about Iraq, Mrs. Bentley. What you witnessed. How you managed the trauma afterward. Do you experience episodes where you lose control of your actions or decision-making ability? I'd prepared for this. Ellen had walked me through it 3 times. I have PTSD, I said. Diagnosed in 2010 after returning from Afghanistan. Treated from 2010 through 2013. Full medical files are available from the VA upon request. What does your PTSD look like? Dr. Cole's voice was gentle, but her questions were surgical. Hypervigilance, difficulty sleeping, heightened startle response to loud sounds. It was worse immediately after deployment. The therapy helped. Do you lose control? No, I said firmly. I learned to function through it. That's what the therapy taught me, not to eliminate the symptoms, but to manage them so they don't interfere with daily life. Dr. Cole made notes. And you're currently caring for an 8-year-old child. Does his presence trigger any episodes? To save Silas, I had to sit in that Salem office and let a stranger with a voice recorder examine the nights I woke up unable to breathe, the months of therapy learning not to flinch at loud sounds, every wound I'd worked so hard to heal, and speak about them as clinical facts rather than living pain. "Doctor," I said, meeting her eyes. I taught 47 combat nurses how to maintain absolute focus when everything around them was collapsing. I trained medical personnel to perform emergency procedures under artillery fire. An 8-year-old child on a quiet farm is not a behavioral control challenge. Dr. Cole studied me for a long moment. Then she made another note. The session lasted 90 minutes. When I walked out, I didn't know if I'd won or lost. The following week, Ellen called. The evaluation came back. Full custodial capacity, no psychological contraindications. Dr. Cole's report actually praises your self-awareness and management of your condition. I sat down at the kitchen table, relief flooding through me. The weapon Clayton tried to use against me had become proof of my strength instead. That same week, late at night, Stuart brought his complete intelligence file on Vernon Garrett to the farm. We descended into the secret cellar where no one could overhear. Stuart spread documents across the small desk under the single overhead light. Vernon Garrett, biology professor at the University of Oregon. But that's just his day job. He simultaneously runs the Garrett Research Foundation, a private research fund exempt from public audits or oversight. "One more thing," Stuart said, sliding another photograph across. "Vernon visited this farm twice in Russell's final year, April and September 2019, came under the name of an agricultural consultant. Russell let him in not knowing what Clayton had already signed. Vernon photographed all 12 research journals during those visits. That's how Silas read them in Portland. Vernon gave Clayton high-resolution digital copies to keep the boy oriented toward the research, grooming him from infancy. I picked up one of the documents, a corporate registration form. 8 years ago," Stuart continued, 2015, this foundation paid Clayton Bentley $340,000. He slid a contract across the desk. I read the description carefully. In exchange for exclusive access to the research data and biological materials of Dr. Russell Bentley. Biological materials. Silas was born in 2015. This is human experimentation without FDA approval. I said, my voice barely above a whisper. A federal crime. Direct violation of 21 CFR, Part 312. Stuart confirmed. Prosecutable under 18 U.S.C. 371. Human biological experimentation requires FDA approval. Vernon Garrett never filed for one. He paid Clayton for access to Russell's genetics and to Silas. I read the dollar amount again. $340,000. What kind of man sells his own father's life work and his newborn son's biology to a private research foundation for $340,000 in cash? Every medication they gave Silas, I said slowly, every treatment, every chemical suppressant for 8 years. Wasn't therapy, Stuart finished. It was experimentation, illegal human biological research without FDA approval, without informed consent, without any oversight except Vernon Garrett's private foundation. I sat back in the chair staring at the contract. Clayton had sold his son the day he was born, not abandoned him, sold him. Russell knew, I said. That's why he hired you 18 months before dying, why he prepared this cellar, why he left the journals for Silas to find. Stuart nodded. Russell discovered the contract somehow. He knew his son had sold his grandson to Vernon Garrett for experimental research, and he spent the last 18 months of his life preparing a defense system, the cellar, the journals, me everything. I looked at the contract again. The signature at the bottom was Clayton's, dated March 2015, 2 months before Silas was born. Clayton had negotiated the price before his son even existed. Can we use this in the custody hearing? I asked. Ellen thinks yes, Stuart said. It establishes treating Silas as property rather than a child. More importantly, it's a federal crime. If we submit this to the court, we're obligated to report it to the FBI. Once the FBI gets involved, Clayton and Vernon both face criminal prosecution. $340,000. Clayton sold exclusive access to Russell's genetics when Silas was born, which meant every medication, every treatment, every chemical suppressant they'd given that child for 8 years wasn't therapy. It was experimentation. Illegal human biological research without FDA approval, without informed consent, without any oversight except Vernon Garrett's private foundation. And Russell had known that's why he'd hired Stewart 18 months before dying, why he'd prepared the cellar, why he'd left the journals for Silas to find. The question was no longer whether to fight it, was whether to destroy them in family court or federal court first. That night I had to tell Silas what Russell had prepared for him and what Vernon had tried to take. Late April at the Oregon farm arrived with longer days and the eastern plot showing its first green shoots. That Saturday evening after dinner, Silas and I walked outside together onto the back porch, without either of us suggesting it, drawn by some unspoken understanding that important conversations happen best in the quiet spaces between words. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the Oregon spring moon rise over the eastern plot, where Russell used to grow his experimental barley. The air carried the scent of damp earth and new grass. Silas had been sitting with his notebook closed on his lap, his small hands resting on the green cover. I could feel the weight of something building in the quiet, the way I used to sense incoming casualties before the radio crackled with coordinates. When Silas finally spoke, his voice was calm and measured, carrying no obvious emotion, just pure inquiry. "Grandma, you know I'm not a normal child in the biological sense, right?" The question landed like a precision strike. I kept my breathing steady, years of combat medicine teaching me never to show shock when a patient asks something they already know the answer to. "When did you learn that, Silas?" I asked quietly. "From reading Grandpa's journals," he said, still looking at the eastern plot rather than at me. He wrote, "Vernon attempted to alter the expression of my genetic markers in the child's early development using the research data I gave him in good faith before I understood his intentions. He could not fully override what nature had already written. The child will know his own mind as he grows older, regardless of what Vernon tried to suppress." I set the journal down. Russell hadn't just suspected experimentation, he'd known exactly what Vernon had attempted. And he'd written it down so I would understand when the time came. He turned to look at me directly, then 8 years old, with eyes that had seen too much, processed too much, understood too much for any child. "Are you afraid of me?" he asked. "Because I'm different." What does it do to a child to have to ask the one person protecting them whether they're afraid of what that child is, to have to voice that fear aloud? Because 8 years of chemical suppression taught them that different means dangerous. I thought about Russell's journals, about the carefully documented research showing Vernon's attempts to manipulate genetics, about how Russell had discovered it and spent the last 18 months of his life preparing defenses, about the $340,000 Clayton accepted to sell his son's biology before the child was even born. I thought about every medication Silas had tracked in his green notebook, every dose documented with clinical precision. Every day he'd lived as an experiment rather than a child. And I thought about the question he was really asking, "Am I safe with you? Will you reject me when you understand what I am?" Before I answer the question that no child should ever have to ask, comment, A, if you think I should tell him the full truth about what Vernon did, or B, if I should protect him from knowing yet. Add one short reason why. A quick note. Some details ahead are fictionalized to convey the emotional weight of this moment. I reached over and took his hand. It was small and warm in mine. "Silas, your grandfather, chose very carefully," I said. "He understood what Vernon was trying to do, and he made sure you would have what you needed to be yourself, not what Vernon wanted you to be. And I choose you, not because you're different or the same, but because you are you." The simplicity of it seemed to reach him in a way complex explanations wouldn't. He nodded once, processing with that careful attention he gave everything. Then he turned to look toward the eastern plot where the first shoots of new life were breaking through winter-dead soil. His next words carried no uncertainty, no question in his voice, just statement of fact. "We will replant the barley there after we win the case. Not if we win. After we win." As if the outcome had already been determined and we were simply moving through the necessary steps to reach it. Some people hedge their bets with maybe and if we're lucky, and I hope so. But strategic minds don't speak in conditionals when they've already run every calculation and decided victory is the only acceptable variable. "After we win," I repeated. "Yes. The court date is in 2 weeks," Silas said. "Ellen filed the preliminary briefs yesterday. Stewart confirmed Vernon Garrett received his subpoena. Clayton knows we have the contract now." He spoke like a military strategist reviewing troop positions, 8 years old and planning legal warfare with the precision of a combat veteran. "Are you ready?" I asked. "I've been ready since I started the Green Notebook," Silas said. "I documented everything because I knew someday someone would need proof. I just didn't know it would be you who'd use it." I looked at this child sitting beside me under the Oregon moon illuminated by the soft porch light. The child Vernon Garrett had tried to turn into a research specimen. The child Clayton had sold before he was born. The child Russell had protected with his dying breath. The child who'd saved himself by documenting his own destruction with scientific precision. "Your grandfather would be proud of you," I said. "I know," Silas replied. He wrote in the journal, "Any child raised by Margaret will be extraordinary. He was right about you, Grandma." Margaret, my full name. The name Russell always used when something mattered. "We'll win," I said, not hoping, not wishing, stating. "We will," Silas confirmed. We sat there on the porch as darkness settled over the farm, over the eastern plot, where new life was breaking through old soil, over the laboratory, where Russell had built his defense systems, over the house where Silas had finally found safety. 2 weeks until the courtroom. 2 weeks until Ellen would file the motion that would force Vernon to testify. 2 weeks until Clayton would have to face what he'd done. 2 weeks until we would prove that some children document their own survival because they understand no one else will save them, and sometimes those children grow into forces that reshape everything around them. "After we win," Silas said again softer this time, "we'll plant the barley together." Together, I agreed. I learned something sitting on that porch under the April Oregon moon that 20 years of combat medicine had never taught me. Not everyone says if. Some people who've tracked their own poisoning in perfect clinical notation, people who've created legal timestamps before adults understood there was a war coming, those people only say when. Silas had already decided we would win. The courtroom was just the inevitable conclusion. Silas's certainty became mine over the next 2 weeks as we prepared for war. 2 weeks before the May trial, I sat in Ellen Stratford's Salem office for our final strategy session. The manila folder Ellen slid across the desk contained exactly what I'd been waiting for, official notice that Professor Vernon Garrett had registered himself as an expert witness for Clayton's side. "Vernon Garrett has registered as Clayton's expert witness," Ellen said. "He'll testify that the farm environment lacks required medical parameters for a child with exceptional biological profile, and that you're conducting unauthorized developmental observations by allowing Silas access to Russell's laboratory." Stuart Harrington, sitting beside me, started to object. "That gives Vernon credibility, makes him look like a concerned academic." "Good," I said. The single word stopped Stuart mid-sentence. I met Ellen's eyes. "Let him testify. He'll have to swear under oath that he possesses detailed knowledge of Silas's specific genetic structure. Then we ask one simple question. How does a university professor who's never met an 8-year-old boy possess that biological data?" Ellen's expression shifted from worry to understanding. "I'll file the motion for Silas's witness competency evaluation immediately. The judge will interview him in chambers before trial opens. He'll clear it," I said. "He's been preparing since the day he started the Green Notebook." The night before the trial at 10 p.m., I sat at the kitchen table rereading Ellen's trial strategy notes when Silas emerged from his room carrying his Green Notebook open to a page I'd never seen. A hand-drawn diagram arrows connecting boxes labeled with partial account numbers, corporate names arranged in a cascade showing money flowing from the Garrett Research Foundation through 3 shell entities to Clayton's personal accounts. "I finished the connection map," Silas said. "The numbers from Stewart's files, I saw the pattern of how the money flows from Vernon to Clayton through 3 shell companies, just like reading a biological sequence. The child tracked his own poisoning, created legal timestamps before adults saw the war coming, and now 12 hours before testifying in court, handed me a financial map that connected every piece of the conspiracy, using nothing but pattern recognition and a green pen." I picked up my phone and called Ellen. "Lorraine, is everything—" "Ellen, I need to file supplemental evidence disclosure under ORCP rules," I said. Silas created a financial flow diagram from the legal documents Stewart provided, mapping the money trail from Vernon to Clayton through shell companies, sending you scans now. "Send them immediately," Ellen said, her voice sharp with urgency. "I'll file the disclosure at 7 a.m. before we arrive at courthouse." I photographed Silas's diagram and sent the images to Ellen. 8 years old, creating evidence that would destroy his father's defense. 7 in the morning on trial day, dew still clung to grass and the sun hadn't brought warmth yet. I watched Silas finish his breakfast, the same plate of scrambled eggs, the same glass of milk, the same chair he'd sat in every morning for 7 months. Routine was his anchor. Today I needed it to anchor me too. Stewart drove us towards Salem in his gray pickup truck. In the back seat, Silas asked without looking out the window, "Are you scared?" I thought of Kandahar Field Hospital. 3 wounded soldiers and no backup medevac. "I've stood under incoming fire with 3 casualties and no reserve ammunition," I said. "I'm not afraid of an air-conditioned room with a judge." Silas nodded once. "Soldiers don't march into battle shouting war cries and beating drums. They walk in quietly carrying everything they need, knowing the noise will come soon enough when the first shot is fired." Stewart pulled into the Oregon County Courthouse parking lot. Morning light reflected off the glass entrance. Through the windshield, Clayton stood by the courthouse entrance in an expensive charcoal suit, flanked by 2 attorneys. Beside him stood Professor Vernon Garrett, 62 years old with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to academic authority. This was the first time I was seeing him face to face. Clayton saw the truck, saw me through the windshield. I looked back at my son, at the man who'd sold his child before birth, at the attorney who'd used his mother's combat trauma as a weapon. 7 months since he'd left Silas on my porch in the rain. Neither of us looked away, neither blinked. "Time to go," Stewart said quietly. I opened the truck door. Silas climbed out his green notebook tucked under his arm. We walked across the parking lot toward the courthouse entrance. Clayton's eyes tracked me with every step. I didn't look away. Didn't slow down, didn't show anything except the same calm I'd maintained under mortar fire. We reached the entrance. Clayton and I stood 6 feet apart. "Mom," he said. "Clayton," I replied. Vernon Garrett studied me with clinical interest the way a researcher examines a specimen. I met his eyes with steady focus. This man thought he could buy genetics, thought he could experiment on children without consequence. Today, he would learn otherwise. I looked at Silas standing beside me holding his green notebook, then back at Clayton. I kept walking. The courthouse doors opened ahead of us, heavy and indifferent. Somewhere inside, a judge was already reviewing the morning docket. We had 72 hours of preparation and 18 months of evidence and 1 green notebook. It would have to be enough. We walked through those courthouse doors side by side and everything changed. The courtroom smelled like furniture polish, and fear I recognized that second scent from my combat nursing days, when soldiers waited for triage decisions that would determine whether they kept their limbs. Judge Dolores Whitaker, 60 years old with silver hair pulled into a tight bun and wire-rimmed glasses perched on a narrow nose, had the kind of face that gave nothing away. I couldn't tell if she was skeptical, sympathetic, or simply exhausted by another family tearing itself apart in her courtroom. She called court to order at 9 o'clock sharp. We are convened for an emergency custody hearing regarding Silas Bentley, minor child age 8. Judge Whitaker said reviewing the file before her. Petitioner Clayton Bentley seeks return of custody. Respondent Lorraine Bentley opposes. Before we proceed with procedural matters, are there preliminary statements? I stood before my military training could second-guess the decision. Take initiative. Control the narrative. Don't let the enemy establish position first. Your Honor, before we begin procedural matters, I need to present evidence regarding the true reason my grandson was brought to my farm in October. Clayton's attorney rose immediately. He was everything I expected, mid-40s expensive suit, the kind of polished presentation that came from representing clients who could afford to manufacture reality rather than simply present it. Your Honor, Mrs. Bentley's accusations are... Judge Whitaker held up one hand. I'll hear from Mrs. Bentley. However, Mrs. Bentley, this is a custody hearing, not a criminal trial. I'll allow relevant background if it directly pertains to the child's welfare. Proceed. It pertains entirely to his welfare, Your Honor, I said. My son brought Silas to me because he needed alibi coverage while he committed fraud against his own child. The courtroom went silent. I felt Clayton's eyes boring into the back of my head from where he sat behind his attorney's table. Judge Whitaker set down her pen. That's a serious allegation, Mrs. Bentley. You'll need to support it with documentation. I have documentation, Your Honor, I said, including surveillance evidence, financial records, and a medical journal my grandson maintained documenting systematic chemical suppression over 8 years. Clayton's attorney stood again, and this time Judge Whitaker let him speak. Your Honor, we have documented evidence that Mrs. Bentley has exhibited increasingly erratic behavior, including baseless accusations against my client, who has been the primary financial provider for his son's care. He moved with practiced efficiency, pulling documents from a leather portfolio and approaching the judge's bench. I watched him hand over what looked like a thick file of evidence. These invoices show consistent payments for specialized tutoring, medical consultations, and therapeutic services, all paid by Mr. Clayton Bentley over the past 7 months. The attorney continued. We also have email correspondence showing Mrs. Bentley demanding that Silas be sent to her farm, contradicting her current narrative. I looked at Silas sitting at our table. He wore the carefully ironed white shirt we'd chosen together that morning. His fingers gripped his pencil with the same precise pressure he used when measuring grain moisture levels, methodical, controlled, unafraid. He was writing in his green notebook, his head bent over the pages with absolute focus. Clayton's attorney wasn't finished. Furthermore, Your Honor, we have an independent psychological assessment. He produced another document. Dr. Harlan's evaluation based on interviews with family acquaintances indicates concerning patterns consistent with paranoid ideation in elderly individuals under stress. Mrs. Bentley's own history of post-traumatic stress disorder from combat service raises additional questions about her capacity to provide stable care. The lies were wrapped in official paperwork and expert credentials. I'd seen this before, disinformation tactics dressed up as professional assessments, the kind of operation where truth doesn't matter if the presentation is polished enough. But one detail caught my attention. Dr. Harlan's assessment was based on interviews with family acquaintances, not with me, an independent expert who'd never met the subject of his evaluation. That wasn't expert testimony. That was character assassination by proxy. I had a sudden memory flash standing in a field hospital in Afghanistan, watching a commanding officer present falsified reports about civilian casualties. The same careful language, the same authoritative tone, the same absolute conviction in the face of documented lies. I'd stood there knowing the truth, but lacking the documentation to prove it. The same helpless rage I felt now watching Clayton's attorney perform. But this time was different. This time I had documentation. Judge Whitaker studied the documents Clayton's attorney had presented, her expression unreadable behind those wire-rimmed glasses. She looked at me, then at Clayton, then back at the file. Mr. Bentley's attorney has presented what appears to be substantial documentation, Judge Whitaker said. Mrs. Bentley, you've made serious allegations, fraud, chemical suppression of a child. These are criminal matters, not custody issues. Before we proceed, I need to understand, are you alleging criminal conduct occurred, or are we discussing parenting decisions you disagreed with? Criminal conduct, Your Honor, I said. My son sold his child's biology for research experimentation without FDA approval. He medicated Silas not for treatment, but to suppress evidence of that experimentation. And he abandoned him at my farm when his financial empire started collapsing. Clayton's attorney stood immediately. Your Honor, this is exactly the kind of paranoid narrative Dr. Harlan's assessment warned about. Mrs. Bentley is a combat veteran with documented PTSD who has constructed an elaborate conspiracy theory to justify— I have bank records, I said, cutting him off. A contract, surveillance evidence, and 47 pages of medical documentation, written by Silas himself. Judge Whitaker removed her wire-rimmed glasses, studying me with an expression that could be skepticism or concern. Mrs. Bentley, these are serious counter-allegations against you. Do you have documentation to support your claims, or are we proceeding on emotion? The silence that followed felt like the moment between incoming mortar rounds and impact. That split second when you know something is coming, but haven't yet heard the explosion. Silas stopped writing. He set down his pencil with careful precision. Then he tore a page from his notebook, the sound of paper separating, echoing in the quiet courtroom, and slid it across the table to me. His expression hadn't changed. He looked as calm as when he explained garden metaphors or calculated barley yield projections, as though he was simply passing me a grocery list rather than whatever evidence he'd been preparing for exactly this moment. The paper Silas handed me contained 3 words in his careful block, printing "Ask about biology." I looked at him. His face remained expressionless, but his eyes held something I'd learned to recognize, the same focused stillness he showed when he discovered the barley seed contamination. He was giving me a weapon. Judge Whitaker cleared her throat. Mrs. Bentley, I'm waiting for your response to the counter-allegations. Your Honor, Ellen said, standing smoothly, we have documentation. But more importantly, we have expert testimony that will demonstrate the biological facts behind this case. Clayton's attorney, Roger Pemberton, mid-50s expensive suit, stood immediately. Your Honor, the defense also has expert testimony regarding the child's biological profile and specialized medical needs. Then let's hear it, Judge Whitaker said. Mr. Pemberton, call your witness. The defense calls Dr. Vernon Garrett. The courtroom doors opened. Vernon Garrett entered with the careful dignity of academic authority. 68 silver-threaded beard corduroy blazer, with leather elbow patches, wire-rimmed glasses catching the overhead lights. He moved to the witness stand like a man accustomed to lecture halls, not courtrooms. After the oath, Pemberton approached. Dr. Garrett, please state your credentials for the record. I'm Professor Emeritus of Plant Biology at UC Davis. I've published over 200 peer-reviewed articles on genetic inheritance patterns in agricultural species. I've served as consultant to the USDA and several international agricultural organizations. And your relationship to this case, I've known Clayton Bentley for 15 years through his work in agricultural genetics. When he expressed concerns about his son's welfare, I agreed to review the situation from a biological perspective. Pemberton nodded. Dr. Garrett, you've reviewed medical documentation regarding Silas Bentley. I have. What did you find? Vernon adjusted his glasses. Silas has an exceptional biological profile. His genetic markers indicate unusual developmental characteristics that require continuous, specialized medical tracking. His father was absolutely correct to maintain regular monitoring protocols. I felt my chest tighten. He was making it sound legitimate, scientific, reasonable. And Mrs. Bentley's decision to terminate this monitoring, medically inadvisable, Vernon said firmly, potentially dangerous. Pemberton returned to his table. Your witness. Ellen stood. She didn't approach the witness stand immediately. Instead, she remained behind our table, one hand resting lightly on the edge. Dr. Garrett, you testified that you reviewed medical documentation regarding Silas Bentley. That's correct. What medical documentation specifically? Blood work results, genetic screening reports, developmental assessment records. From which medical facility? Vernon hesitated for half a second. Various facilities. Could you name one? I believe some came from Stanford Medical Center. Ellen picked up a folder from our table. Your Honor, we contacted Stanford Medical Center. They have no records of treating Silas Bentley. She set the folder down again. Dr. Garrett, have you ever personally examined Silas? No, but have you ever met him? No, however. Have you ever received written consent from either parent to review his medical records? The courtroom had gone very quiet. The records were provided to me by... That wasn't my question. Ellen's voice remained perfectly calm. Have you ever received written consent as required by HIPAA regulations to review this child's medical information? Vernon's jaw tightened. Not formally, no. So, you've never examined Silas. You've never met him. You've never received legal consent to review his records. Yet you just testified under oath that you possess detailed knowledge of his genetic markers and developmental characteristics. Ellen paused. Dr. Garrett, how is that possible? The silence in the courtroom wasn't empty. It was full of understanding, clicking into place like tumblers in a lock, turning all at once. Vernon's face had gone pale. The genetic information was provided through appropriate research channels. Research channels. Ellen let the words hang. Dr. Garrett, what research study was Silas Bentley enrolled in? I'm not at liberty to... Was he enrolled with parental consent? Research protocols are confidential. Your Honor, Ellen said, turning to Judge Whitaker. Dr. Garrett has just testified that he possesses detailed biological data about a minor child he's never met, never examined, and never had legitimate access to. The only way he could possess this information is if Silas was subjected to genetic testing without proper consent, which would constitute both medical malpractice and potential criminal conduct. Pemberton shot to his feet. Objection counsel is testifying. Overruled, Judge Whitaker said quietly. Her expression had changed completely. Dr. Garrett, I'm going to ask you a direct question. Where did you obtain genetic information about this child? Vernon's hand gripped the witness stand rail. For 3 seconds, he didn't speak. From research data, he said finally, collected through the Garrett Research Foundation, and who authorized that data collection. Another pause. Then Clayton Bentley signed consent forms. For what purpose? For ongoing developmental monitoring. Monitoring conducted by whom? Vernon's eyes found Clayton's across the courtroom just for a fraction of a heartbeat. Clayton looked down at the defense table, jaw tight. 2 seconds of absolute silence. Vernon's knuckles had gone white against the rail. Judge Whitaker leaned forward slightly, her expression no longer neutral, but alert, focused. They'd been caught. The trap had closed. I should have felt triumph. Instead, I felt my attention pulled sideways towards Silas. He sat perfectly still at our table, hands folded, expression unchanged. And he hadn't stood up yet. Then he stood. Silas rose from his chair with the same unhurried precision he used when planting seeds, no wasted motion, nothing for show. Ellen reached for the green notebook he'd been writing in since October and carried it to Judge Whitaker's bench. Silas's green notebook hit the evidence table with a sound like a gavel. Your Honor. Ellen said, I submit Defense Exhibit 12, a detailed pharmaceutical log maintained by the child over the past 7 months. Judge Whitaker opened the notebook. Her expression shifted as she turned the pages. The entries document specific medications, dosages, and manufacturer serial numbers. Ellen continued, We request the court cross-reference these with the medical receipts Mr. Clayton Bentley submitted as evidence of his care provision. The judge read silently for 30 seconds. Then she looked up at Ellen. How old is this child? 8, Your Honor. This is remarkably detailed. Judge Whitaker, there's also a financial flow diagram hand-drawn, but remarkably precise. The judge turned to the page Ellen indicated. I'd seen that diagram myself. Silas had shown it to me 3 weeks ago in the farmhouse kitchen, explaining it the same way he explained irrigation patterns. Money flowing through accounts like water through channels. Judge Whitaker studied the page. Mr. Pemberton, I'm going to read several entries aloud, and I want you to locate the corresponding medical receipt your client submitted. She adjusted her glasses. March 14th. Ritalin 10 milligram lot, number R-47829, CVS Pharmacy, Fresno. Do you have a receipt matching that date? Pemberton shuffled through his files. Yes, Your Honor. March 14th, CVS Pharmacy. What does the receipt show? Pemberton's face had gone careful. It shows a prescription pickup. For Ritalin. A pause. No, Your Honor, for amoxicillin. I see. Judge Whitaker's tone remained neutral, but something had changed in the courtroom air. Let's try another. April 6th. Blood draw. Garrett Medical Diagnostic Sample IDSM 4477. Do you have documentation for that date? Pemberton flipped pages. April 6th shows a pediatrician appointment at Fresno Children's Clinic, not at Garrett Medical Diagnostics. No, Your Honor. The pharmaceutical tracking in Silas's notebook was precise enough to cross-reference with Clayton's receipts and expose which medications were real and which were fabricated fraud. My grandson had been documenting his own exploitation with the same methodical attention he gave to seed contamination. Judge Whitaker closed the notebook carefully. Mrs. Bentley, did you know your grandson was keeping this record? Not until January, Your Honor. Mr. Bentley, she looked at Clayton. Did you know? Clayton's jaw was tight. He didn't answer. Ellen stepped forward. Your Honor, the notebook contains 7 months of evidence that the medical care Mr. Bentley claimed to provide was partially fabricated, while undisclosed medical procedures were conducted at facilities he never mentioned in his custody filings. I glanced at Silas. He stood beside our table, hands at his sides, face calm. Watching my 6-year-old grandson stand in a courtroom full of adults who'd been manipulating him for profit, I understood something I'd been slow to see. He'd been 3 steps ahead of all of them since October. He hadn't been running from the experiments, he'd been gathering evidence. Judge Whitaker turned her attention to him. Silas, your attorney mentioned a diagram. Can you explain what it shows? Silas looked at Ellen. She nodded. Your Honor, may I explain the diagram? Yes. Silas walked to the evidence table. His voice carried clearly through the courtroom, not loud, just precise. It's a cash flow map. Money moved from the Garrett Research Foundation through 3 accounts before reaching my father. The receipts my father submitted show spending, but they don't show origin. He pointed to the page. If you track backward from the spending to the source following the direction of transfer, you can identify where the funding originated. Judge Whitaker leaned forward. And where did it originate? The Garrett Research Foundation. The courtroom went completely still. Silas continued in that same patient tone, the exact voice he used when explaining why certain seeds wouldn't germinate in clay soil factual and unhurried teaching adults what they should already know. Water flows downhill from its source. No matter how many creeks it passes through, if you read the flow direction backward, you find your way back to the spring. He looked directly at Vernon Garrett, still frozen at the witness stand. The spring here is the Garrett Research Foundation. Vernon's face had drained of color. Silas traced the diagram with one finger. The contract my father signed paid $340,000 over 2 years. The funding came from a research grant titled Longitudinal Developmental Tracking in Genetically Optimized Pediatric Populations. The grant was issued by the Garrett Research Foundation in September 2022, 1 month before my father brought me to the farm. The entire conspiracy traced back not to Clayton alone, but to Vernon's organization. The ex-husband had orchestrated the scheme from the beginning, using his own grandson as research material. Ellen spoke quietly. Your Honor, the Garrett Research Foundation is directed by Dr. Vernon Garrett, the witness currently on the stand. Judge Whitaker's expression had gone completely neutral, the kind of neutral that meant she was holding back fury. Dr. Garrett, you testified that you reviewed Silas's biological data through appropriate research channels. Are those channels connected to a research grant you personally authorized? Vernon's hand remained white-knuckled on the witness rail. He didn't speak. Dr. Garrett, did you pay Clayton Bentley to provide his son for genetic research? Silence. Did you authorize medical procedures on a minor child without the knowledge of his legal guardian? Vernon's jaw worked, still no sound. Judge Whitaker let the silence stretch for 5 full seconds. Then she looked at Silas, really looked at him, taking in the 6-year-old boy who'd just dismantled a conspiracy with a hand-drawn diagram and a garden metaphor. She turned her gaze back to Vernon, still frozen at the witness stand. "Dr. Garrett, do you have anything to add to this testimony?" Vernon's mouth opened. No sound emerged. He did not answer. Judge Whitaker let the silence hold for 3 more seconds. Then Ellen Stratford stood. The blue folder in her hands contained 2 months of preparation, distilled into 3 pieces of evidence that would end everything in the next 90 seconds. "Your Honor," Ellen said, "we have additional documentation." She opened the folder with the careful precision of someone who'd rehearsed this moment 20 times. 3 exhibits came out in order. Layer 1, a $340,000 contract between Dr. Vernon Garrett and Clayton Bentley for unauthorized human research violating 21 CFR Part 312 prosecutable under 18 U.S.C. 371. She placed the contract on the evidence table. The contract is signed by both parties. It specifies genetic modification monitoring in a minor subject without FDA approval or institutional review board oversight. Judge Whitaker took the document. Her face went absolutely still. Layer 2 recorded conversation between Mrs. Paloma Bentley and Clayton Bentley, legally obtained under ORS 165.540, admissible in Oregon court. Ellen placed a CD on the table next to a typed transcript. In this conversation, Mrs. Paloma Bentley confronts her husband about the experimental contracts. Mr. Clayton Bentley does not deny the charges, he confirms them, and attempts to justify the decision financially. Paloma had been recorded. Either she'd cooperated with Stuart Harrington's investigation, or she'd been caught on tape confessing details of the conspiracy she'd discovered herself. Either way, her voice would testify against her husband, even though she sat somewhere far from this courtroom. Layer 3 surveillance documentation maintained by licensed investigator Stuart Harrington over 18 months proving premeditation, traced to Dr. Vernon Garrett's 2020 research journal. Ellen placed a bound report on the table. The journal contains preliminary notes titled Longitudinal Tracking Protocol Garrett Genetic Line. Dr. Garrett began planning this research using his own grandson 3 years before Clayton Bentley signed the contract. Vernon remained frozen at the witness stand. Clayton had gone pale at the defense table. Judge Whitaker looked at each exhibit in turn. Then she looked at Vernon, then at Clayton. She picked up her gavel. This court recesses. The FBI Portland Field Office and the United States Attorney's Office will be formally notified regarding violations of 21 CFR Part 312. The gavel struck once sharp as a rifle shot. 90-minute recess. The courtroom emptied slowly. Vernon was escorted out by 2 bailiffs. Clayton remained seated, staring at nothing. Ellen touched my shoulder. "Wait in the hall. Don't speak to anyone." Silas and I sat on a wooden bench outside the courtroom for 90 minutes. He read a book about soil composition. I watched the clock and tried to breathe steadily. When the bailiff called us back and Judge Whitaker stood behind her bench, she didn't sit. Based on the entirety of evidence presented, she said, voice carrying to every corner of the room, this court grants full legal and physical custody to Lorraine Bentley under ORS 109.119 based on established psychological relationship best interests of the child and clear parental unfitness. The words hit my body before my mind caught up. My lungs filled with air that felt different than it had 90 seconds ago. My spine straightened. My hands, which had been clenched in my lap for 2 hours, slowly opened. The moment between Judge Whitaker lifting her gavel and speaking the next word lasted an entire year, compressed into 2 seconds victory, arriving in my chest like water, finally breaking through a dam. Furthermore, Judge Whitaker continued, this court refers the complete record to the FBI Oregon Field Office and the United States Attorney regarding violations of 21 CFR Part 312 child abuse under ORS 163.545 and financial fraud. She looked directly at Clayton, then at the empty space where Vernon had sat. Adjourned. The gavel fell. Silas sat beside me, calm as a weather forecast green notebook closed on his lap. We walked out through corridors that smelled like floor polish and old wood. Ellen walked ahead, phone already pressed to her ear, coordinating next steps with someone. Stuart Harrington waited by the front doors, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, the trace of a smile on his weathered face. Outside warm May afternoon, sun hit my shoulders. The courthouse steps were granite, worn smooth by decades of footsteps. 3 of us stood there, Silas, Stuart, and me. Silas looked up at me. "Did you know we'd win?" "No," I said honestly. The evidence was strong, but a courtroom is still a courtroom. "Me too." He adjusted the notebook under his arm. "I prepared for both outcomes. If we lost, there was always appellate court." I stared at him. My 6-year-old grandson in his white button-down shirt, green notebook tucked under one arm like a farmer carries a ledger. May's sunlight catching in his dark hair. He stood with the same straight posture Margaret had at 8, same calm expression, same absolute certainty that truth eventually wins if you document it properly. He'd been thinking 3 legal steps ahead while appearing simply patient throughout the entire trial. "Your grandfather would be so proud of you," I said quietly. "I know." Silas looked out at the street. "He wrote it in his last letter to you. I found it in the desk drawer in November. Any child raised by Margaret will be extraordinary." My throat closed. Russell had written those words 6 months before he died, not knowing he'd have a grandson, not knowing that grandson would stand on courthouse steps, having just dismantled a genetic research conspiracy with hand-drawn diagrams and a green notebook. "He was right," Stuart said from behind us. I looked at my grandson's safe, now legally, mine protected from the men who'd tried to turn him into research material. The Oregon afternoon smelled like cut grass and distant rain. Cars passed on the street below. Somewhere in that courthouse behind us, federal prosecutors were already being briefed on violations of medical research law. We'd won. 2 years of combat had ended on a May afternoon with a gavel strike and sunlight on granite steps. I let one single tear drop. Just one. 3 days after the verdict, I hadn't slept more than 20 minutes at a time, and then Ellen Stratford called about something Russell had left that could only be opened now. Her office smelled like coffee and old paper. Silas sat beside me in the same chair he'd occupied during our first consultation 8 months ago. Ellen placed a metal lockbox on her desk. "Your husband left specific instructions that this envelope could only be opened after the custody case was won," she said. "He filed it with our firm in 2016. 7 years ago, 3 years before Russell died, 4 years before Silas came to the farm." Ellen unlocked the box. Inside lay a single manila envelope, Russell's handwriting across the front in black ink, to be opened only after case 1. Russell. My hands shook as I broke the seal. 4 pages handwritten on Russell's farm stationery, the kind with the Vance Grain logo in the corner that he used for seed inventory. His careful block printing filled every line, no wasted space. "Margaret, if you're reading this, it means you won. I knew you would. In early 2015, months before Silas was born, I discovered Clayton and Vernon had signed a contract to conduct unauthorized genetic research using potential future offspring of the Vance Grain patent line. The contract specified longitudinal tracking from birth through adolescence. Vernon needed genetic material from Russell Bentley's direct descendants, our son's children, to prove the Vance Grain modifications could transfer across 3 generations. I couldn't confront them directly. Vernon would have found another way, used another lab, buried the evidence deeper. So I did something simpler. I swapped the genetic samples Vernon had been storing since Clayton's childhood, replaced them with blanks from the County Agricultural Extension seed, bank standard barley, no modifications. Vernon has been working from falsified data for 7 years. Any research he published based on those samples is void. Russell had sabotaged the conspiracy 7 years before Silas arrived. He'd been protecting us from beyond the grave, trusting I'd be strong enough when the moment came. The letter continued. I knew 3 things with certainty. First, only a child with the real Vance grain sequence could crack the next generation drought resistance problem that's been defeating us since 2012. Second, only you have the fierce love required to protect that child from men who'd turn genius into profit. Third, Clayton would eventually need money badly enough to sell what he thought he owned. I'm sorry I left you to fight this battle alone, but I also know you don't need me to fight it. You never did. You don't need to be extraordinary, Margaret. Just be yourself, as you always were. I love you. I always knew you'd find way home even if soil changed. Russell, I read the last line 3 times. Russell's handwriting blurred. The same careful block printing he used for seed inventory labels now explained how he'd been protecting us since 2016 without ever telling me, trusting I'd have the strength when October came, when a 6-year-old boy showed up with a backpack and a secret. Grandpa used the same metaphor I did, Silas said quietly beside me, about water finding the spring. He did. Do you think he knew I'd use it in court? I looked at my grandson. I think he knew you'd find the right words when you needed them, the same way he knew I'd fight when you needed me to. Ellen cleared her throat gently. There's one more thing. Russell included documentation of the sample swap enough to invalidate any research Vernon published using that genetic data. I've already forwarded it to the U.S. Attorney's Office. 6 weeks later, Clayton requested a visit. No lawyers, just him and me. The county detention facility waiting room smelled like disinfectant and fear. A corrections officer led me to a booth with security glass between 2 chairs and wall-mounted phones. Clayton sat across from me in a gray detention jumpsuit. He'd lost weight. His face looked older than 34 lines around his eyes that hadn't been there in October. He picked up the phone. I picked up mine. "Mom," he said, "I'm sorry." I remembered his face at 4 years old, scarlet fever temperature spiking to 104 at midnight, me sitting beside his bed with cool cloths until dawn, broke and the fever finally dropped. The same vulnerable eyes looking at me now through security glass, the same need for me to fix everything, make it right again. But Clayton at 34 behind security glass looked exactly like Clayton at 6, with scarlet fever in one crucial way and utterly different in another. The vulnerability was identical. The responsibility was not. Some things a mother cannot fix. Some things a mother should not fix. "I hear the apology," I said, "but it belongs to Silas, not me." Clayton's jaw tightened. "He won't see me. He's 8. You sold him to your ex-father-in-law for genetic experiments. He doesn't owe you forgiveness on your timeline." "I didn't." He stopped. His hand on the phone was white-knuckled. "Vernon said it was just monitoring, medical tracking. I thought—" "You took $340,000, I said quietly. "You signed contracts. You knew." Silence on the line. The kind of silence that meant truth settling into bones. "When you're ready to apologize to Silas properly," I said, "I'll make sure he's informed. Not today." I hung up the phone. Clayton's mouth moved behind the glass, maybe saying my name, maybe saying please, maybe saying nothing at all. I couldn't hear him anymore. I stood. The corrections officer opened the door. I walked through it down the corridor that smelled like industrial cleaning solution past the security checkpoint through the double doors. Ellen had called 2 days before with Paloma's outcome, a negotiated plea full cooperation with federal prosecutors against Vernon in exchange for reduced charges. 2 years, probation, 500 hours community service, and surrender of all assets connected to the Garrett Foundation contracts. No detention. Clayton had refused to cooperate. Paloma had not. The law, Ellen said, rewards the first one through the door. Outside July, Oregon's sun hit my shoulders warm and steady. The parking lot stretched ahead, heat shimmering off asphalt. Behind me, the gray detention building sat solid and immovable. I didn't look back. Some things you have to leave behind to step forward. Some doors you leave unlocked even if you're not sure anyone will ever walk through them. I got in my truck and drove toward the farm where my grandson was waiting. The farm came into view 20 minutes later, fields stretching green under July sun. Silas was sitting on the porch steps with his green notebook waiting. 9 months passed. April 2024 morning, Silas looked at the eastern barley plot for the first time in 5 years and said, "Let's plant barley today." But the center came first. November 2023, 6 months after the verdict, Stuart Harrington drove a wooden post into the ground at the farm's entrance while I held the sign steady. White letters on blue background, Callaway Center for Exceptional Minds. "Russell wanted this," Stuart said, securing the final bolt. "He just didn't know the funding would come from the very thing they tried to take." The patent that Vernon and Clayton conspired to steal, worth millions in agricultural licensing, had been transformed into something Russell never imagined but would have loved. Every dollar of that value now funded a tuition-free sanctuary for neurodivergent children across Oregon. The farmhouse became classrooms. The barn became a workshop. The fields became outdoor laboratories where children who thought differently could learn at their own pace in their own way. Transformation of trauma into sanctuary, that's what Ellen Stratford called it when she filed the nonprofit paperwork. Opening day, 8 children arrived. Ages 7 to 11, each one referred by school districts that didn't know what to do with minds that worked sideways instead of straight. Silas stood before them in the converted barn, 9 years old green notebook under his arm. He looked at each face, some avoiding eye contact, some fidgeting, some perfectly still. "You aren't broken," he said. His voice carried the same patient certainty he used when explaining grain moisture levels. "You just read the world in different language. We're going to learn together." I watched from the doorway, my grandson teaching what he'd learned through survival, not from textbooks, but from being used as research material, from documenting his own exploitation, from standing in a courtroom and explaining conspiracy to adults who should have protected him. Watching Silas teach those 8 children who thought differently, I realized something profound. He wasn't broken by what happened to him. He'd been refined by it the way heat transforms grain into something stronger, more resilient, capable of feeding others. The center grew through winter. By March 2024, 12 children attended. By April, 15. That April morning when Silas said, "Let's plant barley," we walked together to the eastern plot, Silas, Stuart, and me. First time any of us had stood there since Russell passed in 2019. The soil looked different after 5 years untended. Volunteer grass had taken over. Wild clover dotted the edges. But underneath the earth was still good still. Oregon loam still capable of growing what Russell had spent decades perfecting. Silas carried a canvas pouch. Inside Vance Grain Seed's first legal batch, produced under the provisional license the Patent Office had granted us in February. The same genetic sequence Russell developed. The same drought-resistant barley that Vernon had wanted to steal and Clayton had sold his son to Access. Now it would grow here where it belonged. Grandpa said plant seed into soil damp from rain, not dried by sun, Silas said, kneeling at the plot's edge. It had rained the night before gentle April rain that left the earth soft and dark. Perfect planting conditions. Silas opened the pouch and took out a handful of seeds. His fingers still small still, 9 years old, sorted through them with the same methodical precision Russell had used 40 years ago. The same care Margaret had taught me when I was young. Now passing to the 4th generation in an unbroken line that Vernon and Clayton couldn't sever, no matter how hard they'd tried. "This is the first legal planting in 5 years," I said quietly. "Russell would want you to do it." Silas pressed the first seed into soil, then the second, then the third, each one placed deliberately the right depth, the right spacing. He worked in silence, and I knelt beside him, following his pattern. Stuart stood back, hands in his pockets, watching. No words were needed. The act itself was the healing, pressing life back into earth that had sat empty since grief hollowed it out, choosing to plant again after 5 years of nothing growing there. We worked for an hour. By the time we finished, my knees ached and my hands were dirty. Silas's white shirt had soil smudges across the front. The eastern plot lay freshly seeded ready. He told me once, I said, looking at the planted rows, "She will know when." I think he meant this. Right now, this moment. Silas stood beside me, brushing dirt from his palms. "Know what? When to move forward. I looked at my grandson, 9 years old survivor of genetic experiments, teacher of children who needed someone who understood them, planter of his grandfather's legacy. When to plant again. Russell's words finally made complete sense. Not when to fight, not when to protect, when to plant again, when healing could begin, when the soil that trauma had left fallow could bear fruit again, not erasing what happened, but growing something new from the same earth. "Will it grow?" Silas asked. "Yes," I said, "it will grow." Stuart walked over and put one hand on Silas's shoulder. "Your grandfather would be proud." "I know," Silas said simply. We stood together in the Eastern Barley Plot, 3 people who'd fought a 2-year war against greed and won. The April sun warmed our shoulders. The freshly planted earth smelled like rain and possibility. Russell's message had finally arrived 5 years after he wrote it, carried not in words, but in the moment itself. The moment I understood it was time. Not time to remember, not time to grieve, time to plant. I know now. Knowing when to plant was only the first step. Knowing what would grow from those seeds that came later. The second spring since Silas arrived brought the Eastern barley up green and strong and brought news that Russell's seeds would feed 12 nations before summer ended. May 2024 Farm Kitchen. Silas sat at the table reading Nature Food on my tablet while I made breakfast. He was 9 now, taller, his voice beginning to change in small ways. "Listen to this," he said, not looking up. Preliminary NIH research suggests Vance grain protein, isolate, demonstrates reactivity, with markers associated with early-onset cognitive decline. I set the spatula down. "What?" He scrolled further. "The article says Vance grain's been deployed in 12 nations with severe soil salinity: Ethiopia, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Egypt. Agricultural yields spiked an average of 340% in pilot zones." He paused. "But there's a sidebar about medical research. They isolated a protein compound in the grain. It reacts with cognitive markers." Russell never mentioned medical applications. "Grandpa knew," Silas said quietly. He looked up at me, then his dark eyes steady. He knew the seed wasn't just for crops. He engineered it for people. Russell had engineered Vance grain, knowing it contained protein compounds with therapeutic potential for cognitive decline. Not just agricultural innovation, but medical breakthrough, designed to help people like Silas. People who thought differently, whose brains worked in patterns that typical medicine couldn't reach. He'd buried the discovery inside a drought-resistant barley patent, hidden where Vernon would never think to look. He was 3 steps ahead, I said, the whole time. 4, Silas corrected. He planted the evidence I'd need before I was born. October came again. 2 years exactly since Silas first arrived with his backpack and his silence. I drove to the rural grocery store on a Tuesday morning, the kind of ordinary errand that makes up most of life, the quiet days between the battles. I was selecting Fuji apples, the variety Russell had helped the Jorgensens cultivate 30 years ago, when I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Excuse me, ma'am, those apples are on special today." I turned. Paloma stood 3 feet away, wearing a green apron with Oregon Exceptional Children's Foundation embroidered across the chest. Her dark hair was pulled back. Her face looked older than 32, the kind of aging that stress carves instead of time. She held a clipboard and a box of donated canned goods. We looked at each other across the produce display. The woman who'd helped her husband try to exploit Silas now wore an apron promoting services for neurodivergent youth, organizing donated food as part of court-mandated community service, serving exactly the community she'd helped victimize. Not redemption. Redemption required choice, required understanding, but something close to it, something that looked like justice wearing an ironic mask. "Thank you," I said quietly. Paloma's mouth opened. No words came. I placed the apples in my cart and walked onward down the aisle. She didn't follow. Some conversations happen in the space between words, in the looking and the silence, in the choice not to speak. That night after 9, I sat in the farm kitchen with Earl Grey tea cooling in Russell's favorite mug. Clean paper. Fountain pen, the one he'd used for important correspondence, black ink brass barrel worn smooth by decades of his grip. I wrote a letter not to be mailed, but to be written. Russell, my love, I want to tell you about these past 2 years, about the grandson you never met who arrived in October with secrets locked behind silence, about the cellar you built and the barley rows you left empty, trusting I'd know when to plant them again. I want to tell you about the courtroom in May, where a 6-year-old boy explained conspiracy using the same garden metaphor you taught him through words you wrote before you died, about Vernon sitting at the witness stand with no defense and Clayton behind security glass with no excuse. Writing a letter to Russell that would never be mailed felt exactly like planting seeds in October, an act that made no practical sense but was necessary anyway because some things grow in darkness before they break the soil. Some conversations happen with people who aren't there to hear them, and those conversations matter most. I want to tell you about your seeds feeding 12 nations and healing minds in ways you engineered but never explained, about transformation of a farm into sanctuary for children who need someone who understands that different doesn't mean broken. I want to tell you that you were right about everything, including me. The pen moved across paper in the quiet kitchen. Outside the window, eastern barley rows stood dark against October night, Vance grain growing in soil that had sat empty for 5 years now green, again now bearing the legacy Russell had planted decades before. You told me once I didn't need to be extraordinary, just myself. But Russell, what you left me was extraordinary, not just a mission, but understanding that grief can become purpose, that loss can transform into legacy, that revenge is smaller than redemption, and redemption is quieter than either. Russell didn't just leave me a farm or a patent or even a grandson to protect. He left me a mission that transformed grief into purpose loss, into legacy, something that might have been revenge into something better, protection that extended beyond one child to dozens, then hundreds, maybe thousands. I'm not lonely, Russell. You left me something greater than memory. You left me a mission, and the perfect soul to help me complete it. I signed the letter, folded it carefully, and placed it in the drawer where I'd found his final letter to me 18 months ago. 2 letters now facing each other across the divide between living and gone. I looked out the kitchen window at eastern barley rows in October darkness. The same darkness that covered the soil the night Russell died. The same darkness that held Silas the night he arrived. The same darkness that pressed against the glass while I fought for custody through winter into spring. Sometimes life doesn't take without offering something in return. What it gives back rarely looks like what was lost, but it arrives always in a form you never expected, and always exactly on time. And to you, listening to my story, remember this. Sometimes the people we trust most are the ones we need to protect our loved ones from. Looking back, I wish I'd questioned Clayton more when he first brought Silas to my farm. I wish I'd demanded answers instead of just accepting his promises. Don't make my mistake of trusting without verifying even when it's family. If something feels wrong, listen to that instinct. I waited too long to act, and my grandson paid the price for my hesitation. What I learned through this grandma revenge story is that protecting the innocent sometimes means standing against your own blood. This wasn't about getting even, it was about getting justice for a child who couldn't fight alone. I believe God put Silas in my care for a reason and gave me the strength to see it through when I wanted to give up. The real lesson of any grandma revenge isn't about revenge at all. It's about fierce love that refuses to look away when someone you love is being harmed, no matter who's causing the harm. If this grandma revenge journey resonated with you, please leave a comment telling me your thoughts. Have you ever had to stand up to family to protect someone vulnerable? Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And if you'd like more stories about family loyalty and justice, please subscribe to Her Family Revenge. Your support means everything. Thank you for staying until the very end. As a reminder, some details in this story have been fictionalized for storytelling purposes, but the core message about protecting the vulnerable remains true.